Hey there, and welcome back. Tonight the story is a woman's, a Norfolk one, and it is one of the strangest and warmest lives that has come down to us out of the Old World era. Her name was Margery Kempe, and she was born in the Norfolk port of Bishop's Lynn in about 1373. She was a trader's daughter and a trader's wife. She would be a mother of 14 children. She would sail out of Yarmouth for the Holy Land at the age of 40. She would sit in the parlour of Julian of Norwich. She would be arrested and tried for heresy in 3 Midland towns, and she would talk her way clear of each of them. And in her old age, she would sit in an attic chamber and dictate her life to a youthful curate. And the memoir they made together would be lost for 5 centuries and then found again in a country hall in Lancashire in 1934. It is the first autobiography in our tongue. So tonight we settle in for an old world East Anglian life. If you are new here and you find yourself glad to be in the Shire in the 1400s, glad of the tidal river, the woolcog moored at the wharf, the parish bell, the salt air of the wash, the kindest thing you can do is subscribe, tap the little bell, and stay with us a while. Stay for a medieval night, and the whole idea of it is that you can slip out of your own century and into an older one for as long as it takes to fall asleep. And no one you are about to meet is going to bother you or need you to send a message or an email. So let all that go until the morning. Picture this. It is a spring dawn at low tide on the River Ouse, in the Norfolk port of Bishop's Lynn. The tide has drawn back to its shingle bed, and the wharfs are laid bare along the east bank, timber lattices stitched together with tarred rope. Black stone at their footings, the mudflats beyond winking with the little glass of shallow pools. Somewhere upriver, a heron has decided to walk instead of fly. The wind off the wash carries salt and fish and old tarpaulin, and just under all of that the smell of hops from a brewhouse. A barefoot boy is dragging his wooden pattens after a runaway pig. A townswoman with a basket balanced on her hip has stopped to watch him and to laugh. The harbour is waking. It is called Bishop's Lynn because it belongs to the bishop of the cathedral city eastward. Later, it will be called King's Lynn, when Henry VIII takes it from the church and puts his own initial in the name. But that is a long way off, and in the moment we have entered, what will one day be counted as 1373. The town belongs entirely to the bishop, who takes his rents and holds his courts and appoints his clergy. And the townspeople have their own council under him, and the mayor is a free man named John Brunham, 5 times elected, twice sent as its man of business up to London. Because that mayor is her father, we may begin with him, or rather with the haven he governs, because the place will govern the child as much as the father does. It stands where the great Ouse pours itself into the Wash, which is a bite the North Sea took out of the coast of East Anglia, somewhere in the deep past. It is a wharf town. It is one of the 2 or 3 richest havens of its island, and it thinks of itself as the 3rd settlement of the kingdom after London and York. The wharfs run for the better part of a mile down the east bank, and from them the port ships fleeces out to Flanders and to Prussia and to the Baltic, and imports back stockfish from Bergen, iron from Sweden, wax and pelts and Rhenish wine from the Hans boroughs beyond the sea. The old streets run parallel to the river. There is the Saturday market at the south end, gathered around the church of St. Margaret, and the Tuesday market at the north end, gathered around the newer church of St. Nicholas. And between them, the winding riverfront lanes are packed with the timbered dwellings of the freemen, most of them narrow-fronted and tall, jettied out over the pavement, so that neighbours across a lane can shake hands from an upper window if they lean. The 5 landward gates open toward the Norfolk fields, and the salt mist blows in through them at dawn and rolls back out with the tide. Ships tell you where you are. A Hanse cog is tied up along the wharf. Now, low-sided, single-masted, its hold open, and men lifting out bales of northern hemp with a rope tackle. Just beyond it is a Dutch keel that has come across from Zierikzee with barrels of Rhenish wine. There is a fishing smack. The crew are patching with hot pitch. There is a lighter being loaded with roof tiles, bound for a manor upriver. And the wharf itself is a working street. Coopers rolling barrels, carters shouting for room. A monk in the black habit of the Benedictine priory, stopping to speak with the shipmaster of a Norwich merchantman. A friar begging in his brown cord and bare feet. A boy running a message for a farthing. Just beyond the wharfs, back one lane from the water, stands one of the tall freeman dwellings. It belongs to that mayor, John Brunham. It is a merchant's hall of the local sort, 3 stories and a solar above, its ground floor given over to a shop and a warehouse and a great space. Its upper stories to the family and to the compact households of servants and apprentices and clerks who serve the trade. The great chamber has a floor of tile and a hearth set against the wall, vented up a stone chimney, the newest thing in Norfolk building, which not every freeman yet has, and which John Brunham has fitted because he can afford it and because he has a wife who prefers not to breathe smoke. Inside that hall, upstairs and shuttered, a woman is at labour. Her name we do not have, only her husband's has come down to us, because the old sources have been kinder to men. She has been at it since the middle of the night, and the midwife is with her. A good dame of the district who has done this office 50 occasions before, and 2 of the household women are with them as well. The scent in the room is of birch bark burning on a warming pan, and of new clean linen, and of the herb they are giving the labouring dam to drink, sage and honey in weak ale. There is talk. There is a quiet and level patience. There is no drama at the hour we look in. That is not the way of it. Only the fact that at some point in this Norfolk spring, a red child is put into the mayor's wife's arms, and washed and swaddled and named Margery, and blessed with 3 drops at the font of the church the same day. Because in the old habit no baby is allowed to go a day unbaptized, for fear of what a night might bring. The bell rings for her christening, as it will ring at every hinge of her life to come. Outside, the tide has begun to turn. A crew is starting to unload a bale of Prussian wax from the Hun's cog. The friar has moved on and is standing at the door of the White Friars close a lane away, waiting to be admitted for the noon meal. The heron, in the mudflats, has decided it is the moment to fly after all, and lifts itself away in 3 ungainly wing beats toward the further bank. The port is at its middle morning. The child in the mayor's bower has 3 names now. Margery Brunham for the register, Margery of the Brunham Hall for the street, and a 3rd name, if the old people are to be trusted, that she keeps for her own soul. She has begun, she grows into that dwelling rather than up in it, because a trader's daughter of the local kind grows into her home as a palm grows into a glove. By the time she is 4, she is already useful. She can carry a pitcher of milk from the buttery to the great room without spilling. She can fetch her damn shoes. She can sit on a stool at the hearth while the paternoster is said before supper, and can lisp her way through the beginning of the prayer. Paternoster, quies in caelis, which is the first Latin any English child learns. Her father is a formidable freeman. John Brunham will serve as mayor 5 separate stretches in his long life, and twice as one of the port's 2 members of Parliament, sitting in the Commons under the boy King Richard II. He is what his neighbours would have called a man of substance, a wool trader, with his own warehousing on the river, his own 2 apprentices in the shop, his own dwelling in the trading quarter, and a wife whose linen closet is the envy of her married sisters. He is also one of the men who negotiate on the town's behalf with the Crown, and who once rode up to London to argue its case in a customs matter, and rode back a fortnight later with a royal writ in his saddlebag. He is not, in his daughter's earliest memory, a lecturing father. He is a trader in a wool gown, gone by the 2nd bell of the morning, and back only at supper. But he is a presence. The hall-boards creak differently under his step. The servants set the trestle earlier when he is expected. The apprentice sweeps the shop twice instead of once. He is much respected in the port. When he passes through the Tuesday market, the market dames dip a knee to him. When he goes to Mass at St. Margaret's on Sunday, he sits in a pew that has his name carved into the wood. She notices such things very early. Her memoir, dictated 6 decades later, still speaks of her father in a phrase of quiet pride. She never leaves off being John Brunham's daughter. Her dam, whose name history has failed to keep, runs the hall. That is the old word for it. She runs it. She sets the kitchen, orders the butter and cheese, keeps the linen, keeps the accounts of the pantry bread, buys her salt at Michaelmas and her spice from a Venetian merchant twice a season, disciplines the maids, hires the wet nurse if she has need of one, and every Friday sends up alms to the White Friars for the priory table. It is her job to sense the difference between a good bacon and a poor one at 100 paces. It is her job to sense when the salt cod is running low. It is her job to sense which of the 2 apprentices is sneaking bread at night. She is a free man's wife, and one of her sort at Bishop's Lynn is by any measure a working woman. She learns the hall from her dam. Not by lesson so much as by presence. By standing at her elbow while the ledger is added up on Friday evenings, by watching the maids ferment the family ale in the little brewhouse behind the yard, by helping to card wool by the fire in the cold months, when the merchants are not sending any and there is a spell for handwork. She learns the calendar of the local devotions, Candlemas and its blessed tapers, Lent and its herring, Easter and its butter, Rogation Tide and the beating of the bounds. She learns her prayers first in English and then in Latin. She learns to read a little, though never to write, which she will recall with anger 6 decades on, when she cannot write her own memoir and must beg someone else to write it for her. There are brothers. There is a brother named Robert, who will inherit the trade in due course. And there is a second brother, whose name has slipped out of the record. There is at least one sister. In a burgess's dwelling of 10 servants and apprentices and children, there is never a shortage of company, and she is not raised alone. She grows up in the steady hum of a busy East Anglian home, in a town where every second man is either a trader or a cleric, and every second woman is either a burgess's wife or a nun. Schooling for a girl of her sort in the 14th century means the parish and the home. It does not mean grammar school. It means the cleric who comes to hear the family confess once a week, the friar who comes with a bundle of tracts for the merchant to read aloud after supper, the dam who catechizes her at Saturday's mending, the nurse who recounts to her the stories of the holy ones at bedtime, and the vast illuminated book of hours that her dam keeps in a locked chest and takes out only for the feast days, when she is allowed to sit beside her dam and look at the pictures while the words are read aloud. She grows up saturated in it, the cycle of the liturgy, the round of holy days, the pictures of Christ's passion, the pictures of Mary at the Annunciation and Mary at the cross. It is one of the reasons her later visions will come so vivid and so specific. The pictures were in her from a child. She hears her father and dam talk in the evenings about ships in from Danzig, about the wool tax, about a boy of the neighbourhood who has run off to Yarmouth for a sailor's berth, about the Archbishop of Canterbury who has come east, about the new king. In 1381, she is about 7, and the region stands on the edge of the peasants' revolt. There is talk in the hall of a man called John Litster, who declares himself King of the Commons at Norwich. And the streets hush for a fortnight until it becomes clear that the trouble has passed the port by. She is old enough to feel the parents' relief. She is old enough to notice that adults sometimes go a little pale when they talk. She does not forget it. Weekends turn on the liturgy. On Saturdays, the household walks together to the market at St. Margaret's. The father in a wool gown lined with fur, the dam in a headdress and a kirtle of local russet. The older children walking behind, the youngest in the nurse's arms. On Sundays they walk to the same nave for Mass, and she kneels at the family pew with her dam, and watches the celebrant raise the host at the Sanctus bell, and hears the congregation chant the Sanctus in their home Latin, and smells the good incense of a trader's town that can afford the good sort. She is a Lynn girl to her bones. She loves it. In her book she will never speak a word against her father's hall, but she is also a girl of the 14th century, which is to say, she is a girl whose future has been decided by other people from the day she was born. Her father will find her a match when the hour comes, and her dam will approve of him, and the register will write down her new name, and she will go from being Margery Brunham to being Margery Kempe. When she is 19, or perhaps 20, that hour arrives. A youthful freeman named John Kempe, of a slightly lesser hall, has been at supper twice, and then a third occasion, and has spoken with her father alone. The matter is decided. The wedding is set. The neighbours are told, and a certain quiet excitement fills the merchant quarter, because a match between the mayor's daughter and a rising tradesman of the port is the kind of match a folk likes to talk about at market. We come to the wedding day at the beginning of what will later be called 1393. She is about 20, a fitting age for a Norfolk bride, and John Kempe is only a little older. He is the son of a family with mild holdings in the town, not as rich as the Brunhams by a long stretch, but not to be sniffed at either. He is going to be a free man in his own right in a few seasons' time, and he has the sense to gauge what a marriage to John Brunham's daughter will do for his standing. He is a decent, well-meaning youthful man of the Norfolk type, quiet at trestle, competent in the shop, kind to the servants. He will, in the decades to come, prove more patient with his difficult wife than perhaps any other man of that century would have been. But that lies ahead. The wedding is at the nave door of St. Margaret's in the local custom. The neighbours crowd around, and the celebrant joins their fingers under his stole and asks the 3 questions of consent. Is the man of age? Is the maid of age? Do they take each other freely? And both answer. And the celebrant declares them married in the sight of God and of Bishop's Lynn, and the crowd shouts a blessing. Then the company goes inside for the nuptial mass, and she kneels at the altar rail beside her new husband and receives the blessing on their marriage. It is a simple ceremony. Old world weddings are. Afterwards there is a supper. It is at John Brunham's hall, and the great chamber is decked out for it, the trestles laid end to end for company, the good linen on the tables, the celebrant at the top with the couple, a friar and a Dominican at either end, because in a Norfolk port you invite both wine and cakes, and a roast of local lamb, a lute player from the neighbourhood, a courteous drinking of the health of the bride and of her dam, and toward the end, a solemn giving of the dowry coins in a cloth bag, linen in a chest, an ell of good russet wool, and a silver cup with the Brunham arms on it. And then the couple are taken up to the bower that has been made ready for them, and blessed, and left. Margery Brunham has become Margery Kempe. The first weeks of her marriage are, by her own later account, uneventful in the ways that matter to outsiders. John Kempe has a dwelling in the borough, though a modest one compared with her father's, and a shop from which he does his trade, and 1 apprentice and 1 maid, and she goes into that home as its mistress. She sets the linen. She orders the buttery. She hires a second maid. She sends Friday alms up to the White Friars in the Brunham Manor. She sits with her husband at supper each evening and hears him talk of his day and shares hers. And she goes with him to St. Margaret's on Sunday and kneels at his side. She is happy in these weeks, in the way a Norfolk bride of that period is expected to be happy. That is to say, in the way that has no need to voice anything about itself. She does not, in her memoir, describe them at length. She only relates, in the phrase her scribe wrote 6 decades afterward, that she was youthful and glad in her marriage. She does not go into it. Perhaps she has no need to. The story she wants to relate begins with what came next. What came next was a child. Within a matter of months she is pregnant, in the ordinary Norfolk manner, and the household knows it, and is glad. Her dam comes over from her father's hall to counsel her, and orders that she should not lift, and sends over the local midwife to introduce herself. John Kempe walks about a little bit taller. The autumn goes by and the cold comes on, and toward the end of the calendar turn, she carries a rounded belly under her kirtle, and the household has the child's cradle brought down from the loft and dusted off. Sometime in the cold months of what we would call 1393, some scholars say early in 1394, she goes into labour for the first time in her life. She is about 21. The birth itself is protracted. That is her own word, protracted. It is very hard on her when at last the child is delivered, safe and healthy, and put into her arms in the bower that had been so carefully prepared. She is already ill. Nothing that would kill her outright, but a fever of the sort that came after childbed, and that could linger for weeks, sometimes for months. The midwife stays, her dam comes over again. A cleric is called. It is the customary care of the neighbourhood for a young trader's wife in trouble, and this is where her extraordinary life begins. The fever will not shift. It hangs on for 8 full months, not violently. Not the sort of fever that kills a wife in a night, but the sort that puts her in a shuttered bower and leaves her there. The physicians of the port come to see her. A doctor from Norwich is sent for once. Her cleric comes on his rounds. Her dam sits with her. The baby, a healthy infant boy or girl, the sources never quite say, is put to a nurse nearby and comes back to the shuttered bower only for a blessing kiss from a dam who cannot quite lift her arms. John Kempe walks a little smaller through the streets, because he is afraid what she herself will report about that long stretch, 6 decades on, is that in her mind something dark had opened. She had held a sin in her heart from her girlhood, a thing she had never confided at confession, and now that she was face to face with her possible dying, she wanted to speak it. She sent for her confessor. He came. He sat by the bed. She began to speak, and by her own account, he cut her off before she was well begun, reproached her for the manner of her telling, spoke a harsh word, refused to listen further, and went out of the room. That was what she remembered afterwards. Whether it was strictly true, or a fever's caricature of a true impatience she had glimpsed on his face, it is hard to say, but she felt it. And for months afterwards, she would neither eat nor pray, and would speak only in wild snatches, and would utter the strangest things. Her family kept her in the bower. In the end, in the depth of that illness, she had to be tied to the bed for her own safety, for she had begun to injure herself, biting her own fingers and tearing her clothing and calling out. It is the passage in her memoir that modern readers, when they first meet it, find hard to bear. The old world household had few tools for it. A hard, patient care from her dam, a cleric at the door once a day, a midwife who sat and prayed. That was all. And then, sometime in the spring of what we would call 1394, in the middle hours of a still Norfolk afternoon, with the shutters closed and the sex bell just having rung at St. Margaret's, something happened. She afterwards will relate only that she looked up and saw a man sitting at the foot of her bed. She had not heard him come in. He was a youthful man in a mantle of purple silk, most beautiful. She used that word, most beautiful, and his eyes were tender on hers. He spoke to her. He offered in the phrase her scribe later wrote down, "Daughter, why have you forsaken me? And I forsook never you." That was all. And then he was gone. As swift as the swing of a shutter, she sat up. Her fever had left her. She called for the keys of the buttery, for she was hungry and wanted her supper. She wanted a comb, for her hair had not been combed in months. She wished to see her baby. She dressed. She came down the stairs. The household stared at her. She sat at the trestle as though nothing at all had happened, and ate a bowl of stewed lamb, and drank a cup of light ale, and asked her husband quietly how the shop was doing. He, poor man, could hardly answer, and that was how Margery Kempe rose from her first childbed. She was 22. She would afterwards recount that this was the beginning of her whole later life. It is not that she immediately became a mystic. She did not. She went back to daily work, and she had another child within a season or two, and then another. But something had opened in her that would not fully close again, and that first vision would stand at the beginning of her memoir as its opening fact. She had been shown, in her own bower, in her Norfolk marriage bed, that she was not forsaken. She meant to hold to it. For the next several seasons, however, she lived the quiet life of a youthful Norfolk wife of some standing. She had children in the usual local rhythm, one after another. She kept the household. She dressed as befitted the mayor's daughter, better, in fact, than her husband's income strictly allowed. For she wore gold pipes in her headdress and slashed sleeves of scarlet lined with miniver, and other men's wives who could not afford such finery let her know as much in the street. She had her hair dressed high. She notes herself, prouder than any wife of the port. She did not, in that decade, especially like being directed what to do. It was in this stretch of her 20s, then, that she decided, in the way ambitious youthful women of the merchant class in Old World England quite often decided, that she would like to be a businesswoman in her own right. Her dam had run a trader's household. Her father had run a trader's business. She would run a concern of her own. And what she chose, in about 1399, was the traditional women's trade at Bishop's Lynn. Brewing in the 14th century is a woman's trade. Men do it too, of course, in the alehouses, but at the household and small commercial level, it is the wives and widows and daughters of the freeman class who run it. Every freeman's dwelling in the town ferments its own house ale, and the wives are the mistresses of the brew house, and the natural next step up from the household batch is to sell it. And the port is thick with small brewing operations that supply the neighbourhood. Some are tiny, a wife who sends up a barrel a week to the tavern next door. Some are large, employing 3 or 4 workers, running twin brews on a working 7-day round, supplying half a market street. Her ambition, from the start, is for the second sort. She takes a lease on a brew house near the Saturday market. She hires 2 workers, a strong-armed local man to move the barrels, and a female worker to help with the mash. She lays in malt, hops, that is to make a diet in Bdassen Kumboltin. Ball, the net plate pour esproclay. And by the end of that season, her ale is on sale in 3 of the taverns along the market front, and she is, in her own account, making a very handsome profit. She is proud of it. Her father is quietly proud too. Her husband, John Kempe, is politely pleased and rather baffled, for he has never had a wife's income of his own dwelling before, and does not quite know how to speak of it. For the better part of 3 seasons the brewhouse runs. She employs her hours between the household and the brewhouse, and orders her workers about, and delivers her ale, and lays down her accounts on the trestle at the end of each week, and pays her market dues, and puts money aside. She is, she thinks, a merchant woman now, a freeman's wife with her own trade, and she wears it as a slight and pleasant swagger. And then, without warning, the yeast fails. It is the strangest thing. She has laid a new mash in the vats, put her yeast to it, gone to bed that night, pleased at how the malt was smelling, and come down the next morning to find the vats flat. No head, no fermentation, nothing. She calls in her workers. They stare. They set another mash. The same happens, 2 brews in a row. 3. The yeast will simply not take. She sends round to the neighbourhood for a jug of fresh yeast from another brewhouse, and puts it into a 4th mash, and the same thing occurs. The vats are flat by morning. For 6 weeks she tries and fails, and there is no ale coming out of her brewhouse, and no money coming in, and only barrels of spoiling malt going out to the pigs. She loses a good deal of money in that stretch. Her workers, kind people, offer that they are not sure what is doing it. Her dam, when she asks, only shakes her head and says, "Perhaps it is the well." Her father, when he asks, only shakes his head and says, "Perhaps it is the malt." But she, in her own account of that autumn, hears something else in the flatness of those vats. She hears the beginning of a rebuke. She closes the brewhouse. She sells the lease. She pays her workers their wages and lets them go with a kind word. Her dam calls it a pity. Her father calls it only trade. Her husband, quietly, is a little relieved, because a wife with a brewhouse income of her own has a way of ordering the household that a youthful Norfolk freeman is not quite used to. She sits at supper that evening at the trestle in the Kempe Hall and does not talk very much. She has felt something in the failure that she cannot quite put a name to, but she is not yet ready to change her life. She is only ready to change trades. Within the season, she has taken up a second one. This spell she does not brew. This spell she mills. In the Norfolk of the 1400s, a horse mill is a working piece of business. A wooden mill house with a wheel shaft in the middle and 2 or 3 horses on a beam, walking a circle, turning the wheel that turns the millstones that grind the grain into flour for the local bakers. It is a going concern. It requires a little capital, which she has, 2 horses, which she buys at the local horse fair, a millwright to set up the gearing, whom she hires, and a man to lead the horses in their circle, whom she hires, and a customer, which is any baker who has grain to grind. She sets up her mill in a yard near the water gate. She lays in her first quarter of wheat. She has her horses harnessed to the beam. The millwright sets the gearing. The wheel begins to turn. The first sack of flour comes out sweet and fine. She is delighted. She is back in business. For the first stretch the mill runs well. She walks past it each morning, tallies its takings each evening, feeds her horses their oats, and has more or less resolved to make a proper trade of it. And then, on a Norfolk morning of chill mist coming up from the Ouse, the horses stop. They will not go forward. She stares at them, then her man stares at them, and he uses the goad, and they will not go forward. He unharnesses them one by one, and walks them out into the yard for drink, and they drink well, and eat well, and seem healthy in every limb. And then he harnesses them again to the beam, and puts them back to the circle, and they will not go. They only stand. She sends for another horse, from her father's stable. That horse will not go either. She sends the mill right away to test the gearing. It is sound. She herself walks the circle to see if there is a stone in the path. There is not. The neighbours drift by to watch and shake heads. A neighbour laughs, kindly enough, and says it must be a curse. And she, in her account, does not laugh back. She walks back to her dwelling. She lies awake that night. Her husband, who has not laughed at her once during any of these Lynn ventures, holds her fingers in the dark of their bower and offers nothing. The horses do not go forward the next day, or the day after, or ever again. Within a week, she has closed the mill too. She has sold the horses back at a loss. She has paid off her man. The mill dwelling sits empty. The people of the port are talking, some pityingly, some laughingly. Her dam says plainly enough that the neighbourhood is saying she is under judgment. Her father says he cannot understand it. Her husband is quietly, patiently kind, and she, in the shuttered bower, where she had once seen a youthful man in a purple mantle, sits down and thinks, this is the second failure, and this occasion she cannot put it down to yeast, or to the well, or to the malt. This occasion, there is nothing in the failure, but the fact of it. She kneels down by the bed. She stays a long spell, and when she rises, she does not sense yet what she is going to do next. but she senses what she is not going to do. She is not going to try a third trade. She is not going to make herself a woman of business. That route, she now thinks, is not the one she is asked to walk. What the route actually is, she does not yet sense. But she has resolved, with a trader daughter's decisiveness, that whatever it is, she will begin to look for it. She goes downstairs. She confides in her husband. He listens. He does not argue. That evening, for the first time in her married life, she leaves supper early and goes up to the bower alone and prays. She does not sense the words very well. She has always said her Paternoster and her Hail Mary and her creed, but she has not, until now, tried to pray from the inside. She kneels. She is a trader's daughter and a trader's wife, and it is the spring of what we would call 1403. And she is 30, and she has just closed her second business, and she does not yet sense what she is beginning. But she is beginning. What follows in her life is a period of about 8 seasons that her memoir covers briefly, and that the historians have to piece together from her scattered later mentions. She calls them, in the phrase her scribe wrote down, the seasons of my slow amendment. They run from about the spring of 1403 to about 11 seasons later, from her 30th to her 38th, and in them she becomes, unhurriedly and by daily choice, a very different Norfolk wife than she had been. The first change is her clothing. She puts away the gold-piped headdresses and the scarlet sleeves lined with miniver. She dresses now in a freeman's wife's plain grey wool, with a simple linen coif. Her dame, when she visits, remarks upon it and is answered kindly and firmly. The neighbours notice. Some think it a proper reform, some think it a rebuke aimed at them. For the mayor's daughter is now dressed less finely than any of their daughters, and it makes them feel their own vanity. She is aware of it. She lets it go by. She has decided the second change is at her body. Under her grey wool kirtle, next to her skin, she has begun to wear a hair shirt. It is not the linen shirt of a freeman's wife. It is a garment of horsehair, coarse as scouring cloth, which she has bought quietly from a tailor of the borough, who supplies such things to the White Friars for their novices. She wears it every day. She lets no one see it. Not her husband, not her maid. She washes at the back of a screen in the bower. In summer, it is a scratching, itching penance under her linen coif and her heavy kirtle. In the cold months, it is a private daily suffering that no one but she senses. She keeps it up for months and then seasons. Her memoir will relate only that she wore the hair shirt for a long stretch before her lord bade her leave it off. The third change is her fasting. Not extreme fasting. She is not a desert hermit, but she gives up meat on Wednesdays and Fridays, and eventually on Saturdays as well, and she keeps the 4 ember weeks strictly, and Lent according to the local rules and a little beyond. And she keeps the vigils of the high feasts, and she takes only bread and drink on the eves of her chosen Marian days. Her body slowly becomes thinner. She has more children in this period. The memoir gives no exact tally, but the record suggests her 14th and last is born around now, and each pregnancy, on a thinning body, takes more from her than the last. The fourth change is her praying. She goes to St. Margaret's twice a day now, morning and evening, before matins and after vespers, and kneels at the same pillar of the nave, and says the rosary, and stays till the sacristan has to come round with his broom. She goes to confession weekly at first, then twice a week. Her confessor at this stage is a mild Lynn cleric, kindly enough, more baffled by her than encouraging of her. He absolves her. He shakes his head. He confides in her dame in the street that the mayor's daughter is a hard case for a confessor. Her dame does not sense what to answer, and only offers that Margery has always been strong in what she wants. The fifth change, and the hardest, is inside the marriage. She has not stopped loving John Kempe. Her memoir, when it speaks of him, speaks with warmth and with the sort of quiet affection that comes of 2 decades, shared bed and shared table. But she does not want any more children. She has had, by her own reckoning, more than a dozen, and she is thin, and her body has done its labour, and she wants now to give it to her praying. And so, in what must be about 1408 or thereabouts, she asks him for chastity, not a separation, not a leaving, but a marriage lived as brother and sister under the same roof. He refuses not with anger, but with a Norfolk man's stubbornness. He confides he loves her, he confides he wants her, he confides he cannot agree to that. And she, at the trestle, only bows her head and offers she will keep asking, which she does. For the next 4 or 5 seasons, this is the low, quiet suffering of her hall, a Norfolk marriage strained by a stubborn disagreement. He asks. She yields, because she is his wife, and the church teaches her that she must, but she weeps afterwards. She goes to Mass daily. She asks him again. He refuses again. He is not a cruel man. He is a puzzled and hurt one. He does not sense why the wife of his youth has become this strange, sober woman in grey wool. He waits her out. She waits him out. Neither of them wants the marriage to break. They only want different things from what remains of it. She turns 38. She turns 39. The stretch comes on that will one day be counted as 1412, and then 1413. She is now 40. Her children are older, some already married or apprenticed elsewhere. Her dam is dead, buried out of St. Margaret's these 3 summers past. She has been thinking, more and more, of pilgrimage. Not the little trip of a Norfolk wife to the shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham up the coast. She has done that, but of Jerusalem, of Rome, of the shrine of James at Compostela in Spain. The whole map of the old world's holy roads has been in her head since her dam read her the pictures of it out of the illuminated volume at Candlemas when she was a child, and now, freed at last from childbearing and with her husband's business in order and her older children grown, she is beginning to think she could go. She cannot go, however, without her husband's agreement. That is the old world rule. A wife cannot cross the sea without her husband's leave, and her husband has said no. He has offered it kindly, but no. So the agreement of the pilgrimage is bound up with the agreement of chastity, and she has been asking him for that agreement for 5 seasons, and he has been quietly, kindly refusing. It is the block that stands between her life as it is and her life as she thinks it can be. Then, in the midsummer of what would be that pilgrim year, on a hot June Friday, a modest thing happens in a field outside York that she will remember all her life. She and John are on the road. They have been away from home about a fortnight, on some errand, perhaps to visit a married daughter, perhaps to see a shrine. Memoir is not clear, and they are on their way back. It is a hot, late June afternoon. The wheat in the Yorkshire fields is up to their thighs on either side of the lane. She is walking. He is walking. Neither is riding, because the horse is carrying their baggage, and it is a poor animal, and they have been kind to it. There is a leather flask of light beer at his hip. She is fasting for the Friday and taking only from her own bottle. And she is, as always in this stretch, in her hair shirt under her grey wool. They come to a stile at the edge of a wheat field, and he stops and sits down on it, and takes a long pull from his beer flask, and wipes his lip with the back of his palm. He looks at her and utters a strange thing. He offers his phrase, as her memoir has it, Margery. If a man came here with a sword and threatened to strike off my head unless I lay with you again in the old manner, tell me true, what would you do? She stops. She does not answer at once. The stalks are stirring softly all around them. A bee is going about its work in the ditch. Somewhere over the hedge, a sheep is coughing. She looks at him. She sees his face, the kind, tired Norfolk face of the man she has been married to for 2 decades, the father of all her children, the free man who has never once complained to the neighbours about the strange wife he has been given. And she answers him honestly. She offers she is sorry, but she would rather see him dead than yield to it, for she has promised her body to the service of God, and she cannot take back that promise. He nods. He does not seem angry. He takes another pull. He puts the flask down on the stile. He is thinking, and then he begins to bargain with her. He proposes if she will grant him 3 things. First, that they will lie in the same bed as before, though as brother and sister. Second, that she will pay off the debts he owes locally before she goes away on any pilgrimage. And third, that she will eat and drink with him on Fridays as she used to, and not fast against him. Then he will grant her the vow of chastity for the rest of their lives together, and he will grant her his consent to travel wherever her way takes her. She kneels down in the road, in the dirt right there, at his feet. She thanks him. She weeps, quietly, for she has been asking this for 5 seasons and never expected the answer. And then she asks him to wait a moment. She goes a little way off into the stalks and kneels there in the stubble and asks her God whether she may agree to his terms. She stays a long spell. When she comes back, she assents to 2 of the 3, and she asks him to release her from the Friday one. The Friday fast is dear to her. She has kept it many seasons. And she cannot take up a meal on Fridays even to seal this bargain. He looks at her. He smiles a modest, tired smile of a husband who has been outmaneuvered by his wife in a Yorkshire crop field. He agrees. He confirms the Friday is hers, and they walk on together into the borough. That is how the vow was struck. When she tells it 6 decades later to her scribe, she does not embellish. She recounts it simply, because the plainness of it was what struck her, that the vast turning of her marriage had come not in a chapel, not in a shrine, not in a vision, but out on a working lane, on an ordinary Friday, from a labourer's cup lifted between the 2 of them. It marked her. Her memoir gives the scene a whole section of its own. They travel home in a new peace. They lie in the same bed, as promised as brother and sister. He does not touch her. She does not fear his touching. They eat their supper together at the trestle. She keeps her Fridays. He drinks his beer. They talk more in this second half of the marriage than they had done in the first, for the tension that had lived between them for 5 seasons has been laid down at a northern style, and neither of them feels the need to voice it again. He is proud of her in a puzzled way. She is grateful to him in a wondering way. The neighbours notice nothing, because the marriage looks exactly as it has always looked. Only the inside of it has changed. She now has permission to go. She could set off within a month for the shrine at Walsingham, or for Canterbury, or for the anchoress at Norwich, or, given hours enough and coin, for Jerusalem. And she means to go to all of them in the fullness of seasons. But she chooses, first, the nearest of the 4. She goes down to Norwich, because in the anchor-hold of the parish of St. Julian lives an older mystic whose reputation for wise counsel has reached even Bishop's Lynn. Julian, the anchoress is called, or Dame Julian, or simply the recluse of that Norwich cell. She has not been out of her walls in over 3 decades, and yet her name is uttered in the streets of half of the county. And Margery Kempe, at 40, has decided that she must sit with her. The distance from her port to Norwich by the Old World Way is about 40 miles. She goes by cart. She takes a maid and a manservant and a change of gown and provisions for the journey, and a letter of introduction from her father's old confessor to the cleric of that Norwich house. It is late summer, and the way runs east through Norfolk villages, Middleton, East, Winch, Necton, and comes in by the west gate on the 3rd day. She lodges at an inn near the great priory of the Holy Trinity, and washes off the trail, and eats supper, and lies down early. In the morning she goes to Mass at the priory, and then walks the local streets, and finds her way at last to the Church of St. Julian near the King's Way in Conisford. It is a very plain little chapel. A round tower, flint walls, a low nave. On the outside of the south wall of the chancel, there is a small stone cell built against it, no bigger than the inside of a cart. It has one squint into the sanctuary itself, so that the recluse inside can see the altar and hear the Mass, and one window with a shutter that opens onto the churchyard, so that she can commune with those who come to see her. She kneels on the path before that window. She is admitted. She stays 3 days. Julian, the elder she has come to meet, is by now about 70. 4 decades earlier, as a youthful person in her 30th calendar turn, she had lain sick almost to death in this very borough, and had received a series of visions of the passion and love of Christ, which she had afterwards written out in a slim volume called The Revelations of Divine Love, or as she called it, The Showings. It is the first work we know to have been written in English by a female author. She has been in this anchor hold for at least 2 decades, praying, counselling, writing. She lives on a bowl of soup a day passed in through the shutter by a maid, and offers counsel to whoever kneels at the outside window and needs her. She kneels. She begins. It comes out haltingly at first, then in a flood. She recounts to the elder about her visions, about the youthful man in the purple mantle at the foot of her bed, about the tears that have begun to come to her without warning at Mass, sometimes so loud that everyone stares, about her fear that she is deluded, that the visions are the devil's tricks, that the tears are pride. And Julian, on her side of the shutter, listens. She does not interrupt. When Margery is done, she answers. And this is Margery's memory of it, 6 decades afterward, of a conversation had at a squint in a Norwich churchyard daughter. When the Holy Spirit visits a soul, the soul is given great tears and great sobbings. And no evil spirit can give such tears. Tears, she goes on, are the gift of the Holy Ghost. Be patient with them, and be patient with those who cannot bear them. Set all your trust in God, and fear not the words of the world. She quotes the apostle at her, "The Spirit prayeth for us with unspeakable groanings." She quotes the Psalms. And when the younger woman, weeping now, asks her whether she should be afraid of these strange gifts, Julian answers plain, no, she should not be afraid. She should thank God for them and keep her humility. She went on further, that a soul who was given the gift of tears must not be surprised when the world resented her for them. Christ himself had wept at the grave of Lazarus over Jerusalem, and a servant of his who wept in his name must be prepared to be misunderstood in the streets of a town as he had been misunderstood in his own capital. And here the pilgrim took this to her heart and would repeat it to herself all the way to the Holy Land. A soul which loves God without reserve will be at times a burden to those who love him with reserve. This was to be borne with patience and not answered back in kind. Her own life in the anchor hold was itself a slow, daily wearing away of the will, and Margery on the traveller's road would find it the same. The road would be the anchor hold, and the anchor hold would be the road. And in each of them, the same Christ was to be met. She spoke of Scripture. Judith, she offered, was a good text for a soul of Margery's calling, because Judith went out from her burrow at God's asking, and did what her people would not have imagined possible, and came home the same widow she had gone out. Ruth was a good text for the traveller, because Ruth went to a strange country and kept her love. The Psalms were good at all times, and she bade her keep them by her and recite them daily. She quoted, at the end, a saying of her own, which the pilgrim would remember as long as she lived. Patience is a nobler thing than working miracles. It came in a Norwich English that a Norfolk ear could hear plainly. Margery repeated it back. To be sure of it. Julian nodded. They speak for 3 days, morning and evening. In between, she attends the masses at the anchoress's church and lodges at her inn. She goes home at the end of that week with something she has not carried before in her whole life. A written blessing from an older mystic who has confirmed that her gift is real. Her memoir will call this visit her greatest comfort, and it will be the last occasion she ever sees Julian. The anchoress dies within a few seasons in her cell. At some date the records do not preserve. She reaches home again in the autumn of that stretch, 1413. She is now 40. She has a vow of chastity from her husband, a blessing from Julian, and a plan that only a few of her intimates yet know. She is going to the Holy Land. The road out of Norfolk to the Holy Land begins, as most wayfarers' routes from this island to Jerusalem do, at the port of Yarmouth on the eastern coast. Yarmouth is about 40 miles south along the Norfolk shore, and it is where the traffic from these havens to Rome and to Palestine customarily takes ship for the Low Countries, and there joins the well-worn overland route that runs through the empire and down over the Alps to Venice. From Venice, a friar-led galley sails to the shore of Jaffa in the spring of each cycle, and from Jaffa a donkey trail runs up to Ramla and thence to the walls. It is a route that has been used by wayfarers of her nation for 2 centuries, and it has a rhythm. She buys her passage for it at Lynn, as any traveller of the eastern havens would from a shipping agent on the Yarmouth quay, for a fixed fare that covers her cog to Zierikzee. She leaves home in the middle of the autumn, 1413. Her husband sees her off from the door of their dwelling. He has agreed to it, and he keeps his agreement and does not weep, though his face has a look on it that she carries in her memory the whole journey. Her older children she has said goodbye to at supper the night before. Her small valise is on the back of a hired horse. She rides with a manservant down the coast lane to Yarmouth. The two of them lodge that night at an inn on the quay. In the morning she boards the cog. A North Sea cog is not a comfortable ship. It is a stubby, single-masted, flat-bottomed timber vessel of about 50 tons, with one open hold amidships stacked with bales of wool and salt fish, and a small foredeck and afterdeck, and passengers travel on the afterdeck under a canvas awning, sleeping on rolled cloaks between the barrels. The company she boards with is a mixed travellers group of about 15 Yarmouth merchants doing double duty as guides for the journey, 4 elderly widows going to Jerusalem for penance, a freeman of London and his youthful grown son, a Norwich cleric who has been given leave by his bishop to see the holy places, and a handful of others whose names her memoir does not preserve. They are, to a person, glad to be aboard and eager for the road. They set out from Yarmouth with a following wind on a bright Norfolk morning. 2 days at sea takes them across the North Sea to the Dutch coast, and they put in at the harbour of Zierikzee, on the island of Schouwen, in the mouths of the Scheldt. Zierikzee is a Hanseatic port of good size, walled and steepled. Prosperous with fish and salt, and its wayfarers' hostel is the accustomed first stop of pilgrims from her nation on their way to the Holy Land. They come ashore in a Dutch drizzle. She, who has never before in her life left her island, kneels on the quay and thanks God for a safe crossing. Some of her companions call this a becoming humility. Others call it a bit much. Her weeping at Mass the next morning in the church of St. Levensmonster splits the party down the middle. For the first time half smile at her tenderly, half wince and look away. It is here, at Zierikzee, that the trouble begins that will follow her all the way to the Holy City. The plain trouble of a middle-aged Norfolk woman travelling with a company who did not choose her, and who find her weeping and her fasting a discomfort at table. She will not eat the meat the others eat. She will not drink the wine. She keeps her Fridays. She weeps at Mass. She weeps at meals when the talk turns to God. She weeps in her bed at night sometimes, softly, so that her female companions hear it through the partition and complain. Twice by the time they leave the Hun support, her fellow travellers have gathered without her and agreed among themselves that she is bad company. And once they have gone as far as to send a delegation to the cleric of the party to ask whether she can be persuaded to travel separately. He speaks to her kindly. She weeps. He goes back to the delegation and confirms he has failed. They ride on together anyway, because the road is not safe alone. From Zierikzee, the party rides overland first through the county of Holland, then east into the Empire, into the archbishoprics along the Rhine, and down through the Palatinate, and after that, up over the Alps, through the Brenner Pass into Italy. It is a long overland leg, 6 or 7 weeks, in autumn weather, that turns from wet to cold to bitter. And they are riding the whole way on hired mules with 3 servants leading pack mules behind. They stop at inns in strange-tongued towns, whose names she cannot pronounce. They pay their way with island silver at first, then with Rhenish silver bought at a money changer's in Cologne, then with Venetian silver as they come down toward the passes. They eat wine and bread suppers at Rhineland inns. They sleep 6 to a bower sometimes on the straw. They ride 10 miles a day and stop at the first bell. She is not an easy travelling companion, and by the moment they are well into the Empire, the company has begun to shed her. Twice she has been left behind at an inn while the rest of the party rides on, and both times she is caught up on a hired mule 2 days later, weeping and forgiving. Once she has been given a plain word by the leader that if she cannot keep her tears to herself at meals, she must eat at another table, and she has agreed, because it is better than being sent back to Yarmouth. She sits in the local inns of the Rhineland at a little separate stool by the fire, alone with a bowl of bread and pottage on her lap, and eats. Her fellow travellers do not look at her. She does not blame them. She writes it plain in her memoir, 6 decades later. I was a hard companion, she notes. They come at last, deep in the winter, to the town of Constance, on the lake of the same name, where the vast church council of the day is beginning its business. It is here that she finds her first friend of the road, an old man of the same nation, who has been living in the papal city for a decade, and who has come to Constance for the council, and who takes pity on the weeping Norfolk traveller when he finds her sitting alone in an inn parlour on the edge of the party. His name in the memoir is William Weaver. He is old, gentle-mannered, honest as a Norfolk oak. He offers to travel with her as her guide across the Alps into Italy if her company will not have her, and she, who has been on the edge of despair, accepts. Her group, in fact, is only too glad to be rid of her, and takes her baggage and her mule and rides on. She travels the rest of the way to Venice with old William at her side. He had been a merchant of London in his younger days, and had made a modest fortune in the cloth trade, and had come to Rome in his 60s on a private vow. He had lived there 10 winters in a rented lodging at the Pilgrim Hostel of St. Thomas. He knew all the wayfarers' ways. He knew the inns of the Rhineland by heart. He knew the innkeepers of the Alpine passes by name. He had, in his stretch in Rome, learned Italian and passable German, and a little of the Latin the friars used at Mass. He had come to Constance for the council out of curiosity, and had lodged in the lakeside town at his own charges, and had found in Margery Kempe of Norfolk a soul whom his younger self, back in London, would have crossed the street to avoid, a freeman's wife of a smaller town, in tears at a nave, and whom his older self, in the closing quarter of his life, took at once as a sister. He offered her his hours, his company, his mule, and his knowledge of the way, and asked nothing back but that she pray for him at Mass. She agreed with a Norfolk plainness that surprised him. He remarked afterwards at Venice that he had never met an Englishwoman who took a kindness so plainly. She replied he had never met an Englishwoman who needed one so plainly. They agreed on both. He walked at her mule's shoulder in the harder passes. He asked her, at supper, plain questions about her Norfolk life and about her large brood of children, and listened to the answers. He was, in her memory, the first man of her life since her father to speak to her as a person of the world rather than as a female of the neighbourhood. The way over the Alps in the deep winter that carried them across into the new year, not easy. Snow was already on the passes when they started. They went by the Brenner, because it was the busiest of the passes and the safest, with regular inns along it kept by hostels of monks. They travelled by day and slept by night in the mountain hospices. She had not before seen mountains. She sat her mule in a woolen cloak with a linen coif under the hood, and her hair shirt still under her kirtle, and she wept with chill sometimes, and with wonder at what she saw, and often just because the weeping had become how her body carried her prayer. Old William, walking beside her mule sometimes to warm his legs, was kind to her tears. He did not fear them. He seemed to understand them. It was he, more than any other companion of her memoir, who taught her that the tears could travel. They came down out of the Alps into Italy in early winter weather, and travelled through Verona and Padua, and came at last into the causeway of Venice at the beginning of the Advent season. That maritime republic, at the close of that year, was already the marble port of the traveller's imagination. The domes of St. Mark's, the palaces along the canals, the trading galleys in the lagoon, the ranks of gondolas every landing. She had not thought it possible for a place to be so unlike her home. Her memoir, when it comes to Venice, is spare in its description. She was not a scenery writer, and she was not there to sightsee. But she notes the marble, she notes the canals, she notes a Franciscan friary in the district of San Niccolò dei Mendicoli, where she and William lodged, and where she made her confession to a friar who spoke a fair Norfolk tongue, and where she waited out the cold season. Waiting out the deep winter was the plan. The traveller's galley from Venice to Jaffa sailed only once a cycle, in the spring, and the wayfarers of the empire assembled at the Maritime Republic through the whole autumn and dark season, and paid their fares to the Doge's shipping company for the passage. She paid hers. She had money still, though less than she had come with. She lay in a borrowed room in a friary lodging on the western edge of the lagoon, and waited from November through Christmas and Epiphany and Lent. And she went every day to Mass at St. Mark's or at a nearer nave, and she spoke almost no Italian and made herself understood mostly by gestures, and she wept quietly at each Mass, and no one there minded. For the Venetians were used to weeping travellers, and did not think it strange. She had never known so many bells. Each district of Venice had its own tower, and each tower rang the office at its own hour, and the sound of them running over the canals was unlike anything her Norfolk or York or Rome would ever give her. A broken silver music that came from all directions at once, and that had, in her ear, no beginning and no ending. She stood some mornings on a low stone bridge outside her lodging and listened to them for the better part of an hour before she remembered why she had come out. She noted afterwards, in a phrase her scribe kept, that Venice had wrung her to prayer more sweetly than any city she knew. The friary lodging she kept was a plain one. It was a low stone building with a garden at the back that grew rosemary and thyme through the winter, and a kitchen at the front that fed the brothers a soup of rice and beans and a bread that was leaner than the Norfolk sort. Her cell was upstairs, a bare, pale-washed room with a wooden bed, a low trestle for a table, a crucifix on the wall, and a shutter that looked out over a narrow canal down which the Venetians rowed their little black boats loaded with cabbages and firewood. She kept it tidy. She swept it every morning. She said her hours at the crucifix. She was, in some sense, in her first cloister. She met, in that winter, a handful of wayfarers of her own nation, stranded like herself. There was a Norwich cleric who had come by another route and was booked on the same galley for Jaffa. There was a Kentish widow whose husband had died on the overland leg and who had decided to go on to the Holy Land in his name. There was a youthful man of Ipswich who was doing his own private penance and who did not much want to say what for. They gathered for supper twice, each Advent fortnight, at an inn near the Rialto that a Venetian freeman had made available to travellers of their tongue. She was, at these suppers, a slightly odd guest. She ate no meat, took only from her own bottle, and wept a little at grace. But the little band of that season was too small to exclude her, and they included her. She learned 2 words of Italian a day from the cleric, who spoke it fluently, and she paid him back by cleaning his linen coif. Her Advent was quiet. Her Christmas she kept at a Venetian midnight mass at St. Mark's, where the mosaic of the ceiling was lit by 100 candles, and the crib in the transept was surrounded by shepherds carved of painted wood, and by a Venetian family of traders who had brought their own children to see it. She stood at the back. She did not weep loud. She only knelt when the celebrant raised the host at the high altar, and she watched the light of the candles move on the gold ceiling above her. And she sensed that if this was the basilica of the trading princes, then perhaps a trader's daughter could indeed feel welcome in it after all. She walked back to her lodging in the dark, along a route she had come to know. And she slept. Her Lent she kept strictly. She ate a piece of dry bread and a cup of drink once a day. She fasted twice a week, her friar confessor at the lodging. A small, quick Italian brother, who spoke a limping foreign speech and a good Latin, watched her thinness with a professional eye and offered her at last, plain, that she must eat a little more if she was to travel the sea to Jaffa in 5 weeks. She agreed. She ate a little more. 2 things happened in the winter at Venice that mattered to her. The first was a chance meeting with a party of pilgrims from Bristol, who accepted her into their company for the sea passage. She would not sail alone. The second was a plainer thing, and darker in its way. Old William, who had brought her across the Alps, took a chill in the Venetian damp, and died in his bed, in the friary lodging in the last days of Lent. She sat with him. She said the prayers of the dying at his bedside. She had his body carried out to the friary graveyard and paid for the mass of requiem, and stood at the open ground and wept quietly for the death of the only friend she had made on the road. Then she went back to her cell and packed her valise, for the galley sailed at the turn of the season. She sailed out of the Venetian lagoon at the beginning of that spring aboard a Venetian galley bound for Jaffa. It carried perhaps 200 wayfarers of 6 nations, in tiered wooden berths under an awning on the main deck, and it was rowed by oarsmen of the maritime city, and it stopped at the Adriatic islands to take on drink, and it went down the Adriatic in a fair spring wind. She kept a small berth to herself and shared her meals with the Bristol company. Their leader was a good freeman of that port, who let her weep at mass and did not send her below. She reached Cyprus in 3 weeks, and Jaffa, 2 after that. Jaffa that spring was the wayfarers' harbour of Palestine. It was a small Muslim port on that coast, in what was then the Mamluk Sultanate, and the Sultan of Egypt permitted Christian visitors to land there under the escort of the friars of Mount Sion, who had been the custodians of the sacred places since the loss of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The brothers met each galley at the shore in their brown habits and their sandals, and organized the visitors into a group. and negotiated with the Mamluk officers for the escort up to Ramla and thence to the walls. She came ashore at Jaffa on a hot spring day, kissed the soil of the Holy Land, and was helped up onto a donkey by a lay brother whose Italian she did not understand and whose kindness she remembered forever. The way from Jaffa to Jerusalem is about 40 of our miles. It runs first through the coastal plain, then up through the low hills of Ramla, then up again into the Judean hills, and at last comes to the ridge from which the walls first appear. A pilgrim party rides it in 2 or 3 days by donkey, with an escort of Mamluk soldiers who take a set fee from each traveller and hold off the bandits of the trail. She was among this company. She was fatter than she had been from the shipboard bread and cheese, and she had left off her hair shirt in the heat of the sea and had not put it back on. She was tanned by the crossing. Her Norfolk grey gown was salt-stained. She wore a plain linen coif under a wide straw hat a companion of her Bristol company had lent her, and she had a leather flask tied to her donkey's saddle. She was, at 40, the eldest female in her party by a decade. They stopped at Ramla on the first night and slept in an old Crusader hostelry that had been taken over by a Muslim landlord and let out to Christian companies by contract with the brothers. And she lay on her pallet in a low cell with 3 other Englishwomen and did not sleep. From her praying. In the morning they set out again. The way climbed. The olive groves along the trail were silver grey in the wind. The dust rose in a thin plume behind the donkeys. A shepherd boy watched them from a hillside, and a Bedouin herder passed by on a camel and touched his fingers to his brow in a greeting she did not sense the meaning of. She sat her saddle. She prayed. She counted the donkey's steps. They came, on the afternoon of the second day, to the ridge where the walls come into view. It is a place still, in modern times, called Ramat Rachel. The old world travellers called it the Mountain of Joy. From it, the walls of the holy city rise across a shallow valley in pale, sun-hit stone, with the domes and towers of the churches and the dome of the rock above. A company riding up to that ridge and seeing the walls for the first time was expected to dismount and kneel. She did not dismount. She could not. Her donkey drew up. She looked, and a sob broke out of her, so hard that she nearly fell from the saddle. And the 2 lay brothers who were leading her donkey, one on each side of the bridle, caught her by the elbows and held her upright until she was still. She wept and wept in the saddle for an hour. Her book relates she thought she should die of the sweetness of it. When at last she could go on, they descended together into the valley and up to the gate. And by evening she was inside the walls of the city she had come half a continent to reach. The Brothers of Mount Sion had a set programme for a Christian company in that year. A fortnight was the length of it. No longer, because the Mamluk authorities of the city permitted only that. In that time, a party saw everything a well-instructed old-world traveller was expected to see. Calvary, the sepulchre, the Mount of Olives, Bethany, Bethlehem, the Jordan, Gethsemane, the house of Caiaphas, and left before their permission ran out. The brothers led each company from station to station, a lay brother lifting a wooden cross at the head of them, chanting the versicles of the Passion at each holy place, holding torches at the night stations, and taking with them each evening back to the friars' hostel on Mount Sion, where the pilgrims ate and slept and rose in the morning to begin again. She kept the whole fortnight. She was tired by the end of the first day. She kept it anyway. Her memoir relates that she followed her guides in every procession, morning and evening, and she prayed at every station, and she wept at every station. She cried out so loudly at some of them, Calvary in particular, that her fellow travellers stopped and stared at her, and the lay brother beside her had to steady her by the arm. and once she fell to the pavement in her praying, and could not rise for a long spell until a Bristol widow of her group lifted her up and led her out to a bench in the atrium. Her weeping in Jerusalem was of a different kind than at Ramla, and different again from what she had known at home. It was not the tender weeping she had known at prayer in her bower. It was a loud crying out of the throat, a broken sobbing that came upon her without warning, sometimes mid-station, sometimes at the reading of the gospel, sometimes at the singing of a friar's hymn. She was afraid of it herself. She wondered whether it was a sickness of the mind. She wondered whether it was a devil. Her confessor there, an Italian brother of good learning who had heard her confession twice in the first 3 days, offered her plain, in fair schoolroom Latin, that it was not a devil, but a gift of the Holy Ghost, and that she should keep her humility and not resist it. He offered the same thing Julian had. It settled her. The sepulchre itself she was permitted to enter on the 4th day. The brothers led the pilgrims in at candlelight, all together, one by one down the low door into the small stone chamber where the body of Christ had lain, and each visitor was allowed 3 minutes on the knees at the stone bench. She, when it was her turn, went in and knelt and sobbed, and did not want to come out. When the friar at the door touched her elbow to say her turn was done, she came out weeping still, and knelt on the pavement of the rotunda outside, and stayed there for the remainder of the visit. She afterwards recounted that all her seeing was Christ's dying, and that she was there in the room of it as truly as if she were his own dam. At Calvary they went up at night. It was the friar's custom to do the station of Mount Calvary by torch, and to sing the crucifixion gospel there, and to venerate the stone into which the tradition said the cross had been set. She went up. She sobbed from the bottom of the steps. She lay on the pavement at the top. Her weeping was loud enough that a wayfarer from a different company, a German, complained afterwards to the brothers that she had disturbed his meditation, and asked whether she could be kept from Calvary at the same hour as the others. They, kindly and firmly, refused. They offered that she was a good soul, and the tears were her prayer. The German went off, shaking his head. At the Jordan she was quiet. Her book records this with a certain surprise, that she did not weep there. She waded a little way out in the shallow current with a Bristol widow. She washed her face and fingers. She scooped a little flask to carry away with her. She stood in the reeds and looked at the further bank. It was low sun. A heron stood on a rock, as she had once seen a heron stand at low tide on the Ouse. She did not weep, she only stood a long while. Her friar had confided that the Jordan was the river of humility, and that its current made no noise even in the moving of it, and that a wayfarer who had wept at Calvary should be still there. She was still. At Bethlehem she was permitted, with the party, into the church of the Nativity, and she went down the steps into the grotto where the crib had been, and knelt at the marble star set into the pavement, and kissed it, and wept there too, though quietly. There is a warmth in her book when she writes of that day. She sat afterwards in the sun in the courtyard and ate a piece of bread and a piece of pale cheese that a lay brother had given her, and drank from her flask, and rested. It was the first meal she remembered eating in the Holy Land, in which she felt no shame at eating. She thought of her children. She remembered her dam. She pictured her husband at his Norfolk trestle. She sensed that she was welcome in this stable, and that her dam would have loved to see this place. She did not weep. She only ate her bread. At Bethany she prayed for the raising of the dead. At the Mount of Olives she prayed for those who were about to be tempted. At Gethsemane she knelt in the olive garden the brothers said was the very one, and prayed for those whose friends had failed them. At each of these she wept a little. Not so hard as at Calvary. Her fortnight was a wearing thing. She lost weight. She burned brown in the sun. Her Norfolk grey wool was stained and washed and stained again, and at the fortnight's close the company was directed by their guardians of Mount Sion that its permission had ended, and it must ride back down to Jaffa. She rode back down the same trail she had come up. She wept, without knowing that she was weeping. All the way to Ramla. At Jaffa, she boarded a homeward galley for Venice. She had done it. She had come to Jerusalem. She had walked the way that half the Western world's imagination had been aimed at for 4 centuries. And she had wept her way from station to station. And she was going home. She was 41. The galley put her back at Venice in the middle of that summer. From there, she could have gone north by the same overland route she had come up over the Alps, down the Rhineland, across the North Sea. She did not. She had made a private plan on the long trail up from Jaffa to travel next to the papal capital and to see the tombs of the apostles, and to spend the cold season there in the district of the Hostel of the Holy Trinity, and to come back to Norfolk the following spring. She had money enough still, though not much. She had permission from her husband to be away as long as she needed. She turned south instead of north, and rode down to Rome in the company of a friar of the Franciscan house at Venice, who had been ordered south for his own business, and did not mind her company along the way. They came to Rome in the early autumn. It was the first stretch of a new Pope John the 23rd, by his numbering, whom the council at Constance would soon depose. But the wayfarer's version of the city that she entered did not know or care about that. It only sensed that it was the capital of Peter and Paul. She rode in by the Milvian Bridge, along the causeway that had brought Constantine down to conquer the empire, and came under the Aurelian wall at the Porta del Popolo, and passed down the crooked lane, past the Piazza del Popolo, and down toward the district of Trinita dei Pellegrini and the Hostel of St. Thomas that had been founded for wayfarers of her nation more than 50 seasons before. The St. Thomas Hostel took her in without fuss. It was a plain lodging of a dozen chambers, run by a chaplain and staffed by lay brothers of her own nation, and it kept its guests for the standard fee of a coin a night, and it fed them a bowl of pottage in the evening. She had a small cell to herself. She kept it for the first month and a half, and then she made a decision that changed the shape of her Roman winter. She gave away all the money she had left at the door of the hostel to any beggar who asked her, and she gave up her chamber, and she took her place with the poor. Her book explains it plainly. She had heard a preacher at the hostel say, on Michaelmas Sunday, that the man who would follow Christ must be poor as Christ was poor. She took it into her heart. Within a week she had given away her purse, and her second gown, and her fur-lined cloak, and her silver cup with the Brunham arms, and her 2 rings, and she had kept only her grey wool, and her linen coif, and her donkey, and her drinking bottle. She lodged now at the poor door of the hostel with the beggar wayfarers, and she shared their bowl of pottage, and she went out each morning to St. Peter's, or to San Giovanni in Laterano, or to Santa Maria Maggiore, or to any of the stations of the Roman route, and she prayed. She wore no shoes at Mass. She stood at the back with the poor. The Roman winter came in with rain. It was not the sort of rain the county knew. No long grey blowing sheet off the wash, but a hard, cold Mediterranean downpour that would open out of a clear morning at noon and turn the streets into shallow, stony rivers by the middle of the afternoon. She walked in it. She had never learned, at home, to fear a wetting. She wore her grey wool through it and her linen coif over her head, and she went from station to station with the huddled crowd of the Roman poor around her. And she prayed her way through the wet streets as she had once prayed her way through the tidal lanes at Lynn. The papal capital had one advantage over her port on the Ouse. At every corner there was a chapel, and every chapel had a door standing open, and every open door had a stone bench inside the porch where a wet traveller could sit and dry her linen while she said, a rosary. She made a kind of Roman round. In the morning she went to St. Peter's, up the long slope of the Pilgrim Way across the Tiber, past the massive tomb of Hadrian that the Romans of the day called the Castel Sant'Angelo, and into the atrium of the great basilica itself, which was not yet the domed Renaissance building, but the old Constantinian nave of 900 years standing, its columns thick with candle smoke, and its pavement worn by kneelers to a shallow trough. She heard a low mass at the tomb of the apostle. In the afternoon she went to San Giovanni in Laterano, across the whole city, which had been the mother church of the popes since the 4th century, and which held the papal chair. And in the evening she went to Santa Maria Maggiore, up on the Esquiline hill, which held the wooden manger from Bethlehem. And she knelt at the crib of it and prayed for all her children. She learned the local shrines of the papal seat, the way she had once learned the shrines back at home. There was Santa Prassede, with its blue mosaics and its bone of the martyrs. There was San Clemente, over the buried dwelling of an early Christian, its lower chapel older than her own quarter at home. There was Santa Croce in Jerusalem, which held a piece of the true cross the Emperor Constantine's dame had brought back from the Holy Land, and where anyone already returned from Jerusalem was welcomed as a friend of the family. She walked to each of them in her turn. She stood at the back. She said her rosary in her Lin tongue. She wept softly, sometimes, at the elevation, and sometimes she was still. The papal quarter, she noticed early, did not mind wayfarer tears. It had seen too many to be surprised. Her lodging was the poor door of the pilgrim hostel. She slept on a straw pallet with 3 other women. One from Devon, who was there on her husband's vow. One from Cheshire, who had come alone and would not say why. And an old Irish widow, whose speech she could hardly follow, but whose kindness needed no words. They shared their bread. They shared their little stories at night, before sleeping. They kept each other's Fridays. When one of them was ill, they held the drinking cup for her. It was the first stretch in her life she had lived on the poor side of a door, and she found in it a plainness she had not expected. There was no linen closet to keep. There was no ledger to add up on a Friday evening. There was only the day, and the prayer, and the bowl, and the bed. This was, by any old world reading, a strange choice for a Norfolk trader's wife of good family. Some of her countrymen at the hostel reckoned her a holy one. Some counted her a fool. Some, she is honest about this in her book, believed her a hypocrite, who wanted the praise of poverty without the shame of it, and who would go back to Norfolk and be a trader's wife again. She did not answer them. She kept her poverty. In the middle of the winter, she took service. That is her word, service. An old Roman widow of the quarter, around Santa Maria Maggiore, poor as anyone can be, had need of a servant to fetch her firewood and to draw her drink and to sit with her at night against the loneliness. And she went to her and served her a good part of that season. She swept the widow's floor. She cooked her a hot pottage from bread and old cabbage and bones. She washed her linen. She sat with her at night by a small brazier of charcoal and heard her rambling talk about a husband 40 years dead and a son gone away. She notes plainly the happiest stretch of her Roman stay. The old widow called her Margherita and blessed her at bedtime, and gave her a rosary of wooden beads when she left. While she was in the papal city, she also made a side journey down to Assisi. The way was 3 or 4 days' ride south, and she went with a small band of her countrymen down the Via Flaminia to the Umbrian hills. Assisi in 1415 was the city of Francis, whose brown-habited brothers she had followed all the way from Venice to Jaffa, and she meant to go up to it before she left Italy. She stayed a week. She prayed at the tomb of Francis in the lower nave of the basilica, at the little shrine of the Portiuncula on the plain below the walls, and at the chapel of San Damiano where he had heard the cross speak. She met there a widow from her native county who had come by another route, and they walked back together to their winter lodgings. She was, in this stretch of her life, gathering a company of friends of the road that a rich trader's wife had never had before. At Assisi, she stayed at the friary hostel below the twin basilica, in a small women's dormitory that overlooked the plain. In the morning, she walked up the steep lane to the basilica and heard Mass at Francis's tomb in the crypt, kneeling on the stone with her fingers on the iron grill that guarded it. In the afternoon, she walked down to the plain and prayed at the little stone chapel of the Portiuncula, which was the shrine Francis himself had built with his own hands 2 centuries before, and which still stood, low and simple, at the middle of what would later be a wide precinct around it. She sat on the wooden bench outside the chapel in the low Umbrian sun and watched a pair of doves come down out of the eaves to drink at a trough. She thought of Francis and of the doves he was said to have preached to. She did not weep. She only sat. She met at Assisi an Italian friar of high name, a preacher who was known through the whole of the empire, and who was resting at the mother house between his preaching tours, and he heard, at his supper one evening, that an Englishwoman of good repute was in the dormitory, and he sent word that he would see her. She went to him the next morning in his cell. He asked her questions about her calling. She answered them. He replied, plain, that her weeping was of the good sort, and that she should go on with it, and that a traveller who wept was one who kept her calling on her skin. She went back to the papal city the next day, with the words in her ear. She would report later that she had received in a single Umbrian visit the counsel of 2 Franciscan saints, the dead one at his tomb and the living one at his cell. Her poverty in Rome grew close to the bone. By the end of that season, she had nothing at all left but the grey robe on her back, and even that was in tatters. Her confessor at the hostel, a kind cleric whose name her book gives as Wenceslas, saw the state of her clothes one day and reported plainly that she must be dressed better before she went to Mass, and that he would find her a garment. He asked around a Roman lady of the confessor's acquaintance, sent to the lodging a plain gown of good pale linen, of a kind worn by widow tertiaries of the friary order, and she, who had wondered whether such a garment for herself might be too proud, took it on the confessor's instruction and wore it. From that day, for the rest of her time in the papal city, she went about the streets in that pale gown, and the poor she had lodged with called her the Lady in White. She kept the garment for the road back. She left the papal city in the spring of 1415. She went north with a small band of her nation who had lodged in the hostel the whole winter with her, and they went by the way of Bologna and Padua and Venice again, and up over the Brenner in the mild spring weather, and back through the Rhineland, and to the Dutch coast, and by cog across the North Sea to the mouth of the Great Ouse. She landed back at Yarmouth late in the summer, after almost 2 full circuits of the calendar abroad. She was, at 42, thinner than her husband had ever seen her, browner than any woman of the port, dressed in a plain pale gown that fitted her like something out of a picture of a hermit, and with a leather bag over her shoulder that had a wooden rosary and a stone from Bethlehem and a bottle of Jordan drink in it. Her husband met her at the door of their dwelling. He offered no words, only opened it and stood aside. She went in, she sat down at the trestle. She was home. Her book gives almost nothing about her first evening back at Lynn. She was too tired. She only records that her husband had a bowl of pottage set on the trestle for her and a cup of ale, and that she ate it slowly and thanked him and went up to bed in her old bedchamber. In the morning she rose and went to St. Margaret's and heard Mass. The congregation stared. They had heard, of course, that she had gone to Jerusalem. There had been letters, and a Yarmouth merchant back from Venice had brought word. But the townsfolk had not expected the pale gown or the thinness or the loud weeping at the elevation. Half a dozen women who had known her all her life stopped her at the nave door and asked, kindly enough, whether she was well. She replied that she was. She went back to the hall. For a good stretch after her return, the neighbours came, one at a time, to see her. Old friends of her youth walked around from other quarters of the port to sit with her a while at the trestle and hear what she could relate of the roads. A friar who had never been out of Norfolk begged her, at his own visit, to describe for him the church of the Nativity at Bethlehem, and she recounted it, plain. And he wept a little as she spoke, and said he would carry the picture to his grave. A trader who had shipped goods with Venice for decades questioned her whether she had seen the Rialto and the great galley yard of the Arsenale, the mosaic of the basilica, and she described it all. A widow whose husband had died of plague while she was away came to sit with her and to relate the news of the local dead. She listened. She kept a private tally of them in her head. She said prayers for each at the parish nave the next morning. Her older children she saw one by one over the first month. Her eldest son, a free man of Lynn now with a wife and 3 offspring of his own, came to supper with his family, and she sat at the head of the trestle in her plain, pale gown, and gave her grandchildren the story of the Church of the Nativity, and they listened with the round-eyed patience of children who have been told to sit still and be good. Her eldest daughter came from Norwich with her husband. Her second daughter came from the North Quarter parish with hers. Her son settled at Danzig. She would not see for a long stretch. He was already gone across the sea to Prussia. But she read a letter from him aloud at that supper and passed it around. She unpacked her small valise. She set out on a shelf above the trestle the things she had brought back: a stone from the pavement of Calvary, wrapped in a linen cloth, a flask of Jordan water sealed with beeswax, a bit of dried olive branch from the Mount of Olives, a wooden rosary an old Roman had given her at parting, a scallop shell of the Compostela root which she had stitched onto her linen coif. Her husband looked at each of them in turn. He did not ask her to open any of them. He only offered, quietly, at the end, that it was a whole lot to have carried in one leather bag. Within a fortnight, the local tongues had begun. Some neighbours murmured she had come back a holy woman. Some men murmured she had come back with a swollen head and a foreign gown. A pair of clerics in the town, who had never much cared for her, held that she had come back a lollard, an accusation that would matter greatly in a season or two, because the burning of Lollards had begun in earnest in England under the new king, Henry V, who had been on the throne now for a while. The word Lollard was thrown at her twice in the first fortnight of her return, once by a fishwife of the Saturday market, who did not much care what she meant by it, and once, more dangerously, by a Dominican friar of Lynn who did. Her husband stood by her. That was in all the decades to come. The shape of the marriage? He offered nothing against the pale gown. He offered nothing against her weeping at Mass. He walked with her to the local nave on Sunday. He greeted her old friends when they visited. He did not laugh at her when she cried at supper. And when the second of her accusers came to her one afternoon and asked for a private word, he sat at her side while she gave her answer, and folded his hands and did not interrupt. It was, whatever else it was, an old-world Norfolk marriage that had learned a certain grace in its middle age. The neighbours did not entirely settle around her. They never would. Some of her older children, grown by now and married locally, were embarrassed by her. 2 of them, in their honesty, admitted so, and asked her to be more like her old self at market. She heard them. She did not change. Her mother's kin visited less often. Her father, who was old by now and had lately been mayor for the 5th stretch, spoke to her one evening and begged her not to raise certain matters at the local tavern where he was known. She agreed. She kept quiet where quiet was wanted, and she prayed elsewhere. It was a difficult return, and she is honest about it. But she was there. She was back. And, within a season, she began to plan another going out. Because she had heard, at the Wayfarer hostel in Rome, that the wayfaring route to Santiago sailed from Bristol, and she had, in a private notebook of her mind, added Santiago to the list. By the spring of 1417, she had done what a merchant's wife had to do to take another wayfaring road. She had paid down her share of the local tithes and dues. She had settled the affairs of her household with her husband, and named her older married daughter as the one who would keep an eye on the smaller running of the dwelling while she was away. She had gone to her confessor, and to her father, and to her husband, and taken their blessings separately, each in the customary order. And she had ridden out of Bishop's Lynn on a Norfolk morning at Whitsuntide, on a hired horse with a servant boy, bound for the West Country and the port of Bristol. The route across England was longer than she had reckoned. Bishop's Lynn to Bristol by the old thoroughfares was over 200 miles, and it took her the better part of 3 weeks. She rode west across the fens, through Peterborough and up over the Northamptonshire uplands, and then southwest through Warwickshire and Worcestershire, stopping at inns each night, hearing mass at whatever village nave she found at dawn. She met, on the way, other travellers heading to Bristol for the same fleet. By the time she came into port at the top of the tidal Avon, at the close of a long English May, she was in a small company of half a dozen. Bristol at that season was the second port of the island after Southampton, and it was a working town of rope walks and sailmakers and coopers and taverns and freeman halls along the Avon and the Frome. Its wharfs were stone and its ships were tall. The Santiago fleet, a company of Bristol and West Country cogs that sailed together each spring to Corunna in Galicia and back, carrying wayfarers out and Spanish wine home, assembled in the tidal pool below the 2 parish churches, and it took its passengers aboard through the middle of June. She bought her passage. She lodged while she waited, in the dwelling of a Bristol widow of good name, who let out chambers to travelling women. She went every day to the local church of James, whose patron was the Spanish protector she was going to see. She waited the wind. 2 things happened in that Bristol wait that mattered. The first is that a story of her pale gown, and her weeping, and her Roman cold season, had run before her from Bishop's Lynn to Bristol, and a townswoman of the North Parish quarter, hearing that she was in the port, came to her lodging one afternoon and knelt at her feet and asked for a blessing. She, uncomfortable, gave her only what a friend gives. She offered, "God bless you," and went back to her bread. The second is that a Dominican friar, who had been listening to the local talk, came privately to her lodging one evening and accused her, over the trestle, of being a lollard preacher. She defended herself plain. He was not persuaded. He went away shaking his head, and it was noticed. That accusation was going to catch up with her later, in Leicester, in the shape of a warrant. The fleet sailed on the last day of June with a fair northwest wind. She was in a cog of about 80 tons, in the company of some 40 wayfarers and the crew, and they rounded the Land's End and struck south across the Bay of Biscay in a fresh summer swell. The Bay of Biscay in June was not the North Sea of the previous autumn. It was longer, and its rollers were higher, and its horizons more open. She was sick for the first 3 days. She lay in her berth. She kept her Fridays anyway, drinking a little from her flask. By the 4th day she had found her sea legs, and she stood on the afterdeck in the wind and watched the coast of France go by in the far east, and she prayed the rosary in her Norfolk tongue, and she wept a little at the sunset. Her fellow travellers on this cog were kinder to her than her Yarmouth companions had been. They were folk of the West, and they had heard of her, and they took her weeping as a matter for respect rather than complaint. They came into Corunna after 2 weeks at sea. It was a low, hot, pale-walled Spanish harbour, and the trail to Compostela ran east from it about 50 miles along the coast. They set out on foot the day after landing, with a Galician guide hired by the leader of their band, and they walked in the Spanish summer sun at the pace of the slowest widow among them. It took them 3 days. They stopped at village chapels where they could hear a mass in Latin they recognized, and at wayside inns where they ate a bread of coarse rye and a soup of green cabbage, and drank a rough red wine of the country. She, in her pale gown and her linen coif, walked among them at the middle of the party. She did not weep on that trail. She was too tired. They came to Santiago de Compostela in the afternoon of the 4th day, and saw the twin towers of the vast cathedral rise ahead of them at the top of the approach. She knelt in the dust, as she had learned to do at Ramat Rachel 2 seasons before. She rose. She went in with her company under the arch of the west door. The interior was cool and dim after the Spanish heat, and the incense of the travellers' mass had been burning since the morning, and the Botafumero, the enormous censer that Compostela hangs from its transept ceiling, was swinging in its arc from one end to the other of the crossing. She had not looked for that. She had pictured the tomb of James beneath the altar. She had pictured the Mass. She had not pictured the swinging censer. She stood a long while and watched it go by overhead. She notes afterwards, in her book, that she had seen the incense of the whole world rise and fall. She stayed the fortnight her party had allowed. She confessed at a chapel of the North Transept to a friar of her own nation who was on hand for wayfarers of her tongue. She heard 3 masses a day. She walked out to the modest chapel called Padron, some miles south, where the tradition said the body of James had first come ashore in a stone boat from the sea. She bought a scallop shell of the country, which was the badge of the Santiago traveller, and stitched it onto her linen coif. And when the fleet's captain sent word that the wind was fair for the return, she walked back down to Corunna with her companions, went aboard, and sailed home in a fortnight, coming into Bristol at the end of August. At Bristol, she had a decision to make. She could go straight to Bishop's Lynn by the same route she had come, southeast across the island to her Norfolk county. Or she could go by way of Leicester, where a friar she had met at Bristol had said a friend of hers had lately settled and was ill, and where the town was said to be full of good travellers for the shrine of the Blessed Virgin at Leicester Abbey. She chose Leicester. In hindsight, it was a bad choice, but it was the choice she made, and it landed her within a week into the first of her 3 trials for heresy. Leicester was a big Midland town then, one of the seats of the Duchy of Lancaster, which meant a royal duchy, which meant that heresy was on the mind of every steward. She rode in with a hired servant and lodged at an inn. Within 24 hours she was arrested. Her pale gown, which had raised no eyebrow at the papal city, was in Leicester an oddity, and a rumour had it that only a lollard female preacher would dress that way. The mayor sent his officers to the inn and had her brought before him. He was a Lancastrian freeman of orthodox temper, and he had it in mind that he would earn a name by taking a Norfolk lollard off the road. She was taken to the chapter hall of Leicester Abbey. There, before the mayor, the abbot, and a bench of the local clergy, she was examined on the articles of the faith. Did she believe in the transubstantiation of the bread? She did. Did she believe in the intercession of the holy ones? She did. Did she believe in the authority of the Pope? She did. Did she believe in the sacrament of confession? She did. Did she wear the pale gown as a sign that she was a virgin, being married? She did not. She offered. She wore it at the command of her Italian confessor. Did she preach in public? She did not. She only spoke of God at table and at inns as any Christian did. The bench listened. The abbot took her side. The mayor pressed. In the end, after 2 examinations across 3 days, she was released on the abbot's word and directed to leave the town within the day. She left. But her story had run before her, and by the time she was on the way east, it had reached York, where the Archbishop's court had already sent word to have her met. She meant to travel back by way of York because her married daughter was in Yorkshire and she had promised her a visit. She came into York in the 2nd week of September. She was met at her lodging by a summoner of the Archbishop's court and directed she must appear before Archbishop Henry Boet at the Palace of Carwood, 7 miles down the Ouse. She set out there the next morning with 2 Yorkshire clerics and a friar she had met at York. She stood before the Archbishop. Henry Boet was elderly, close to 80, learned, patient, and not much given to burning women. He examined her himself, in his chapter hall, seated in his high wooden chair, with the gospel volume at his elbow and his clerks at either side. He put to her the articles of the faith. She answered them, one by one, as she had done at Leicester. He queried. In a phrase, her book records exactly why she went about in pale linen. A wife married should wear the wife's black or grey. She answered that her confessor at Rome had bidden her wear it. He wanted to learn whether she preached. She replied that she did not preach, but she spoke of God when questioned. He bade her recite the 12 articles of the Creed. She recited them, in her Norfolk English, without a slip. He inquired whether she had gone up into the pulpit of any chapel and preached. She replied she had not. He then, in a moment, her memoir records as her one triumph over her judges, remarked, and this is her scribe's memory of the Archbishop's remark, she knows her faith well enough. Let her be. She was let go, with a short letter under the Archbishop's seal, that she might travel through the province of York without further hindrance. She left Carwood. She was mobbed at the gate of York by a small crowd who had come to see the female pilgrim the Archbishop had judged. Some jeered, some blessed. She travelled east through the city that afternoon, in company with a friar escort of 2 brothers, and she came down toward Beverley in the East Riding to spend the night, because the way back went past. And in Beverley, the trouble came around a 3rd occasion. At Beverley, the townsfolk had heard she was coming, and a hostile crowd was waiting at the inn. A Dominican of the town, different from the Bristol one, but of the same suspicion, had put it about that she was the Lollard female the Archbishop had been examining, and that she should be examined again by the local council. She was taken from her inn to the Moot Hall and set before a bench of the mayor and the clergy of Beverley. There was no chapter house here, only the inn's chief bower, and no orderly line of clerks. Only the leaders of Beverley, gathered around a trestle, and the townsfolk through the open door. She stood before them. She was tired and hot, and had been on the road 3 months. The mayor put to her the same articles. She answered them. A Dominican pressed her on, why she wore a pale gown. She replied that her Italian confessor had bidden her. A canon of Beverley inquired whether she was a Lollard. She answered, plain, that she was of Bishop's Lynn, that she was the daughter of John Brunham, the mayor, that she was a wife of good standing, and that she believed the whole of the faith as her mother had taught it to her. A friar sitting at the back stood up and swore on the Gospels that she was no Lollard, for he had heard her confess and pray in St. Mary's the evening before. And the mayor, at last, unwilling to hold a Norfolk penitent who had a letter from his own archbishop, let her go. She travelled back to Norfolk in the mild autumn weather of 1417. She came into her husband's dwelling on a Saturday evening. He had heard by letter from a Norwich freeman who had passed through York that she had been examined at Carwood and cleared. He had a hot pottage waiting for her. He had the local cleric at the door to bless her. He offered nothing about the 3 arrests. He only opened his arms, and she went into them, and stood a while, and then sat down at the trestle and ate her supper. She was 44. She had been to Jerusalem, to Rome, to Assisi, to Compostela, and to 3 courts of heresy. She had come home, and she stayed. She stayed for 14 seasons of the calendar. From that autumn to about 1431, she lived at home without going out of it for any long journey. Only the customary trips to Norwich for confession, and once to Ely to see a sister, and once to Walsingham. Her book gives these decades in a set of scattered stories rather than a clean chronology, but the shape of them is clear. She had settled into her port at last, and Lynn had settled uneasily around her. The first and biggest story of this stretch is the church fire. It happened at St. Margaret's in the depth of winter. The exact date the book does not give, somewhere in the earlier 20s of the century. A spark had caught in the wide lantern of the nave, or in the roof timbers over the choir. And by the middle of a January night, the whole building was afire. The alarm went up. The bell tolled its own alarm. The neighbours came out with buckets and hooks. The fire spread. A wind was blowing from the west, and the west wind carried sparks toward the row of freeman dwellings that stood close along the churchyard wall, and the folk began to fear that all of Bishop's Lynn would burn. She, when the church bell rang, went to the parish nave. That is her account, plain as she gives it. She did not stop to help with the buckets. She went straight to the west door, knelt in the churchyard, and prayed. The snow that had been coming down thinly all evening began, according to her memoir, to come down heavily on her back and shoulders as she knelt there. And the wind, so she recalled, shifted around after an hour to the east, and blew the sparks back over the churchyard and out to the salt marshes where they died. And the townspeople, running about with buckets under the shifted wind, managed to put out the roof blaze before it reached the tower. St. Margaret's was saved. And she, kneeling in the snow at the west door, was seen kneeling there by 3 fellow worshippers. And one of them, a fishmonger's wife of the Saturday market, who had never much liked her, walked off afterwards saying, plain, that the mayor's daughter had prayed the fire out. Not all the town agreed. Some held that the wind would have shifted anyway. Some held that the snow would have come anyway. That was fine with her. But from that night on, there was a certain faction who reckoned the trader's wife with the pale gown might be a holy soul. And there was another faction, older, who counted her a nuisance still. And the port became divided in the way a body will be when a plain miracle has been done in its midst. The 2 sides would fight each other in the market street for the rest of her life. Her confessor now was a youthful cleric named Master Robert Springgold. She had chosen him because he was well read, and because he was firm with her when she wanted firmness, and because he took her weeping without a wince. He was to be her confessor for 2 decades, and to be one of the closer friends of her life. She confessed to him weekly. She heard Mass at his elbow. She went to his cell to speak with him about her praying. He listened. He advised. He was patient with her. When she began to weep aloud at Mass, and by this point in her life, the weeping had grown loud enough that some worshippers moved to another pew, he declared plain from the pulpit that she was not to be sent out, and that her sobbing was her prayer, and that a flock which did not tolerate it was a flock without patience. She spent a fair share of her middle age in visits. She went to sit with the sick of the district. She had a quiet reputation for good prayer at her bedside, and the local women would send for her when a neighbour was very ill or dying. She would sit at the head of a bed and hold the sick person's grip and pray in her Norfolk English for the good passage of the soul. She did not weep at those bedsides. She had learned in her 40s to keep her weeping for the nave, where it was known, and to keep it out of the sick room, where it would frighten. It was a distinction her memoir records with some pride. There were quiet comforts in this decade. Her married daughter in Norwich sent for her once each calendar round to keep the octave of the Assumption. She would ride down by cart, spend a fortnight in the ward of her son-in-law, hear Mass at the Priory Church of the Holy Trinity, and return in the mild August weather with a small gift of local lace for a grandchild of her own. Once, on one of these visits, she went again to the anchor-hold at the older woman's church and knelt at the outside window, and found a youthful anchoress in Julian's place, and understood, quietly, that the elder had died. She said a prayer for her at the squint. She did not weep. She had already wept for Julian a decade before. When the news had first reached Lynn, she went once, in the middle of the decade, to the shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham. It stood about 30 miles north up the coast, and it was the vast Norfolk Shrine of the Virgin, second only in the old world imagination to Compostela itself. She had been there as a girl with her dame, and she went again now as a widow in waiting with her older married daughter. The two of them walked the last mile barefoot, as the wayfarers of England had walked it for 4 centuries, and they knelt at the Holy House inside the priory precinct. And she bought a small badge of the shrine for her linen coif to stitch beside her Compostela scallop. Her daughter, who had never done that pilgrimage before, was moved by it in a way she had not expected, and she herself, who had done Jerusalem and Rome and Compostela, was moved by it in exactly the way a trader's daughter of Norfolk is always moved by the first shrine of her childhood. She had her plain ministries. She sat with the dying. She helped women in childbed pray a hard birth through. She kept a small purse of copper coins in her kirtle for the beggars of the town gate, and she gave them out on her way back from Mass each morning. A beggar of the North Gate, an old man of the Hansa quarter with a hurt leg, came to know her grip so well that he would greet her by name before she reached him. She spoke to the young mothers of the district who had heard that she had walked to Jerusalem, and who wanted to learn what it was like. She recounted it plainly. She reported that Jerusalem was a hot yellow town on a hill, and that the Franciscans were kind, and that the way was long, and that the tears were the way. She did not add more than that. The young mothers left thoughtful. She had, in this decade, her own private hours of prayer that no one saw. She rose before dawn on plain days and lit a rushlight and sat by the ashes of the hearth and prayed in the quiet of her own dwelling. She said her rosary. She kept her. Fridays, she read what she could in a book of hours a friend had lent her, though the reading was hard for her and she had to move her lips through the words. She had a wooden crucifix on the wall of her bedchamber that her husband had bought her at a Yarmouth fair 3 decades before, and she looked at it in the low rushlight and prayed and did not weep. She had learned to keep the loud weeping for the parish nave, where it was known. She went out to Mass at the church bell and came back to her husband's slow breakfast at the trestle. She was, in the phrase she gave her scribe long afterwards, a wife who kept the altar. That was all. But a wife of that kind, at Bishop's Lynn, in the reign of Henry VI, was already a good deal. She had her scattered troubles too. The town's Dominicans, always her worst opponents, spread stories about her twice through the middle of that decade, and once petitioned the bishop to have her preaching forbidden, even though she did not preach. The bishop, sensibly, dismissed the petition. A friar preacher visiting once turned around in his sermon at St. James's Chapel and declared to his hearers they should not receive Margery Kempe at Mass because her weeping disturbed their devotion. A dozen worshippers walked out with her that morning in protest. The friar went back to his convent. Master Robert preached the next Sunday from the parish pulpit and offered to the congregation that a body which could not weep with its penitents could not laugh with them either. He named no names. Everybody in the port knew whom he meant. By 1429, or thereabouts, she was in her mid-50s. Her father was long dead. Her mother was long dead. Her older brother had died at home some seasons before, of a fever. 2 of her offspring were dead already, of the plain local causes. 2 more were far away in service, one a boy of good sense who had become a trader in the Baltic port of Danzig, one a girl wed at Norwich. The rest were at Bishop's Lynn, married locally. Dams and fathers of their own. Her husband John Kempe was in his own late 60s now, and had begun to slow. He walked with a stick at times. He did not go up to the loft any more. He preferred the ground floor. He had begun to lose small memories, where he had put his purse. What day of the week it was. The neighbours were starting to speak of him as an old man. They had settled, in this closing decade, into a companionship neither of them had quite expected. He was the plain Norfolk husband still, quiet at the trestle, kind to the servants, careful with the ledger. She was the plain Norfolk wife. Up at dawn for mass, home for the trestle, up in her bedchamber for her evening prayers. They had at last no arguments. The quarrel over her weeping had been long since folded away by the neighbours. The quarrel over her chastity had been folded away by the Yorkshire style. They walked together to St. Margaret's on Sunday. They ate their pottage at the trestle. They sat by the hearth in the wintry evenings and offered very little, the sort of little that a long marriage says, because there is no more to say, and were content in it. He would sometimes reach out at the hearth and put his palm over hers, and she would look at him, and he would smile a small tired smile of the local sort, and neither of them would voice a word. It was the last quiet of the marriage before the fall. In the summer of what we would call 1431, John Kempe had his fall. It happened at the dwelling they had shared for 4 long decades. He was on the wooden stair between the ground floor and the upper bower, coming down at some plain hour of the morning to fetch his hat, and his foot went out from under him. He came down the whole flight backwards. The maid, hearing the racket, ran to him. He was found at the bottom of the stair, on the flagged floor of the hall, bleeding from the back of his head, unable to move his left arm, and speaking a slurred word she could not understand. She was not in the dwelling at the moment. She was at mass at the parish church. She came back to find him laid out on the trestle in the hall, with the maid holding a linen cloth to his head and weeping, and Master Robert Springold already sent for, and the town surgeon on his way. She did not scream. She did not weep. She knelt down at the trestle and carried his good grip in hers. His eyes were open. He knew her. He tried to speak, and the word came out in the slurred manner of a man whose mouth had gone slack on one side. She whispered to him. She murmured, "John, be still." She murmured, "I am here." She murmured, "We will manage." His grip closed on hers. He did not die at once, and he did not recover either. He lived for another 2 full circuits of the calendar and some months, in the shape a man takes after such a fall. The left side of his body did not fully come back. His speech was slurred for weeks and cleared only unevenly. He could not walk without a stick, and after a while he could not walk at all. Only shuffle across a bower holding on to furniture. His mind wandered. He knew her. He knew his children. He did not always sense what date it was. He would sometimes think he was back in his own father's hall, aged 20. He would sometimes think the boy at the door was his eldest son, who was in fact a freeman of the town with grey hair. And he could not, from about 6 months after the fall, keep himself clean. She took him back to her own bedchamber. That is her plain phrase for it. She had lived under his roof, but in a bower of her own for the 15 seasons since the vow of chastity had settled the marriage. In that stretch, had eaten together, prayed together, walked together, and slept apart. Now at his need, she moved his bed into her bower, and she nursed him. It was not a slight taking on. He needed feeding at every meal, for he could not lift the spoon to his mouth with his good palm any more. He needed washing at the back door twice a day. He needed his linen changed. He needed his bed cleaned. He was, at 72, an infant in his wife's care. Her memoir is candid about it in a way that few volumes of that era ever are. She confides, in a phrase her scribe wrote down, that at first it was to her an anguish. She admits she resented it. She recounts asking her God, plain, why after all her decades of prayer and penance, she should be asked to give her days to the washing of a slack-mouthed old man's linen. She confides she wept at the washing tub at the back door. And then she recounts, on a certain afternoon in the 2nd month of his need, hearing her Lord speak to her in the interior voice she had known since her 22nd calendar-round daughter. Thou art doing to me what thou hadst wished thou couldst have done in the flesh at Calvary. And she carried the linen out of the tub and went in and washed her husband's face herself. She never complained again. In the record her memoir keeps. The neighbours came, in the way locals will come to a dwelling with a stricken freeman in it. Her older children came in turn and sat with their father and gave her a few hours' rest and helped her lift him. Master Robert Springold came weekly to confess him and to say a mass for him at the local altar. A widow who had nursed her own husband to his end came several times to teach her the daily tricks. How to lay a linen so that a bedridden man could be turned without hurt. How to make a soup soft enough for a slack mouth. How to prop a head at the right angle for a stroke patient to swallow. She accepted the counsel with a plain gratitude. She had once been the mayor's daughter and had ordered maids about. She was now on her knees at a washing tub. And she found it good for her. The 2 long stretches were hard on her body. She was almost 60 herself. She had not been strong since the last of her children was born, and her Roman cold season had made her thinner. And the pilgrim roads had used her up. She lost weight in the nursing period. Her hair, still not fully grey at 60, went pale in the sides. Her palms, which had always been slender and merchant white, became a nurse's reddened, chapped patient. Her weeping stopped almost entirely. She had no strength for it. She only had the strength for the washing tub and the porridge spoon and the daily prayer that she said each morning at the parish before she came back to spell whichever daughter. Sitting with her father, there was a quiet tenderness in it that surprised her. She had loved her husband as one loves a companion of long standing. She had not, for a long stretch, felt for him the tender pity a dam feels for a child. She began to feel it now. She would sit at his bedside in the evening, when the Compline bell had rung, and hold his good palm, and speak to him softly of plain things, of the wool trade, of their neighbours, of their grown children, and he would smile, as much of a smile as his slack face could manage, and squeeze her fingers. It was, she reported afterwards, the last part of her marriage, and it was the sweetest. He died in the autumn of what would be counted as 1433. Her book gives no exact date. It records only that he received the last rites at the palm of Master Robert on a certain evening, and that he passed at midnight or a little after, and that the bell of St. Margaret's rang for him at dawn, and that she sat beside him at the trestle where his body had been laid out and washed and dressed for the burial, and did not weep. She had already wept. She confides, at the washing tub 2 seasons before. She was quiet now. He was buried at St. Margaret's after the daily mass 3 days later, in the Burgess ground on the north side of the choir. and she walked behind the coffin in the plain black of the widow. The neighbours came out. Master Robert preached a short sermon on the good man's patience. The bell rang. She went back to her hall. Her dwelling was hers now. Her bower was hers again. Her days had, for the first time in her adult life, no man in them at all. She was 60. She was a widow. And within 2 months, in the plain manner of her, she began to plan the last pilgrimage of her life. The plan came out of a letter. Her son of Danzig, the boy who had gone to the Baltic as a lad and married a good Prussian trader's daughter and settled there as a Lynn freeman in exile, had died in Norfolk 2 seasons before, of an illness he had caught while visiting his parents. His Prussian widow had gone back to Danzig with their child. She had written, plain, that she was coming back across the sea to see her dame-in-law before the older woman was too old to see her, and that she meant to bring the granddaughter for a first meeting. She would sail into Yarmouth in the spring. And Margery, who had received the letter in the cold season of 1433, not many days after her husband's death, wrote back with a plan. "Come," she offered. "Come. And when your months here are ended, carry me back with you to Danzig by the same ship. I want to see my grandchild in her own country. I want to see the shrine at Wilsnack, where the holy blood is said to be. And I want to see Aachen, where the Emperor Charlemagne's chapel is." She meant to make one more pilgrim way out of the visit, and if her age took her on it, so be it. Her memoir, when it comes to this plan, sounds like the plan of a much younger soul. She was 61. She did not care. The daughter-in-law came in the spring of 1434, with the grandchild a girl of about 8, with the fair Prussian hair of her dam and the Norfolk eyes of her father. She had them in Lynn for the summer. She showed them her town. She took them to Mass at St. Margaret's. She carried the little girl to the local market and bought her a wooden doll. She wept once at Mass, and the grandchild looked at her with the plain, unfrightened curiosity of an 8-year-old and asked her mother afterwards why grandmother wept, and the mother said, kindly, because she loves God. And in September, on the tide of an autumn morning, Margery Kempe, aged 61, boarded a Hanse cog at Yarmouth bound for the Baltic with her daughter-in-law and her grandchild, and sailed out of her island's waters for the last time. The crossing was not easy. The Baltic in September is not the Adriatic in May. The cog took a squall 2 days out of Yarmouth and had to run before it for a whole night. The passengers lay in their berths and prayed. She, at 61, was sick throughout the squall and could hardly keep any bread down for 2 days after. But she did not complain in her book. She only tells that she was glad again to see the North Sea, and that when the wind fell and they went on eastward through a bright autumn sea, she stood on the afterdeck in a wool cloak and watched the low grey coast of Holstein go by in the distance, and thought of her old friend William Weaver, dead these 2 decades and buried at Venice, and of her dam, dead these 25, and of her husband dead this last winter. And she prayed for all 3. They came into Danzig at the end of the 3rd week at sea. That port, at the hour they arrived, was one of the mighty Hanseatic havens, the eastern twin of Bergen and Zierikzee, with brick warehouses along the Motlawa River and a tall clock tower over the market square and the vast brick basilica of the Blessed Virgin rising above the streets. The Kempe daughter-in-law had a dwelling there, in a lane behind the Long Market, and she was welcomed in and given a bower and a good hot supper of Baltic fish and a Prussian brown bread that she reported afterwards was the best bread she had ever eaten. She stayed at Danzig for a month and got to know her granddaughter, and heard Mass at the great church of St. Mary, and prayed at the high altar. She was again in a strange country. She was again in a working port. She was, in some sense, In a mirror of Lynn on the far side of the world, Danzig had its own rhythm. The Motlauer was busier than the Aus. Its wharfs were longer and its cranes higher. The vast Krantor at the harbour wharf, a timber and brick tower that lifted whole barrels of Baltic amber off the decks of the Hansa cogs, with a treadmill turned by two men walking inside a wooden wheel, was a thing she stood watching for the better part of an afternoon. She saw the amber come out of the ships in cotton bags and go into the warehouses. She saw the wax and the pelts from Novgorod come out of another vessel, go into another warehouse. She saw the English wool come off, yet another, and understood, from the mark on the bales, that some of it was of the Brunham quarter. She stood at the wharf edge and laughed, quietly at the plain fact that her father's trade had come to meet her at the far side of the world. The dwelling of her daughter-in-law was in a lane off the Long Market, in a row of tall brick Freeman halls, much like the timber ones at Lynn, but built for the Baltic weather rather than for the North Sea. It had a wide-brimmed door with an outer wooden porch of the kind the Danzigers called the Beischlag, on which a burgher family sat in the summer evenings to greet the neighbours. It had a stepped gable that rose above the roofline. It had a warehouse below the hall from which the daughter-in-law's father had once shipped stockfish to Bergen. She slept in a small upper bower that had been the sleeping place of her son when he was a Danzig lad. Her granddaughter came to her every morning before Mass, and sat on the edge of the bed, and taught her a Prussian word for a Norfolk one, Brot for bread, Kirch for church, Freund for friend, and she, at 61, learned them with the plain humility of an elder being taught by a child. She spoke them back. She got them wrong. The child laughed. She laughed, too. From Danzig she set out south with a small band of wayfarers, not with her daughter-in-law, who could not leave the child. She went with a Hanseatic trader of good name, who was riding to Wilsnack on his own business, and two of his servants, and a friar of the Danzig house, who was going as her confessor. They travelled inland through the Prussian country, through the pine forests and the shallow lakes and the low brick-built settlements of the Teutonic Order, and came in 3 weeks to the shrine of the Holy Blood at Wilsnack, in the Northern Empire. The Prussian route was not the one she had known through the Empire 2 decades before. That earlier way had been a pilgrim thoroughfare, thick with Rhineland and French parties on their way to Venice. This one was a trader's highway, thick with the traffic of the Order and the Hansa. She passed Teutonic night castles of red brick, with tall square towers rising out of the flat green country. She passed lakes so shallow and still that the sky was in them, and long straight rows of pines that the Order had planted for its shipwrights. She stopped at inns run by German-speaking hostelers who took her Baltic silver and gave her back a bread heavier than any Norfolk loaf and a beer she liked better than she had expected. Her friar of Danzig rode at her side. He was a youthful cleric, no more than 30, who had never been out of the Order's lands, and who was on this pilgrimage to Wilsnack as much for his own devotion as for her guidance. He was patient with her age. He held her mule's bridle at the harder river crossings. He was, in the private tally her book kept of the kind men of her life, one of the last of them. Wilsnack was a small country place whose village chapel had, in the year 1383, been the site of an alleged miracle in which 3 consecrated wafers had bled after a fire on sight. Its fame had swept through northern Europe in the 50 seasons since. Wayfarers came to it from the Netherlands, from Bohemia, from the Baltic, from Poland, and even from England. The building itself was a plain, low brick nave that had been enlarged with a chapel where the bleeding wafers were displayed on the high feasts. Margery Kempe came in during the middle of a Prussian October afternoon with her friar and her merchant, and knelt at the door. She stayed a week. She confessed to her friar. She heard Mass daily. She kept the autumn vigil of the two apostles at the local altar. She wept at the chapel in the loud manner of her weeping in Jerusalem. And she was not shooed out. The Wilsnack townsfolk, being long used to weeping wayfarers, took her tears as ordinary. And then, with her party, she started west toward Aachen. Aachen was the ancient capital of Charlemagne's empire, and its old imperial chapel held the four vast relics of the Western Church, the swaddling clothes of the infant Christ, the loincloth from the cross, the cloth in which the head of John the Baptist had been laid, and the gown of the Virgin, which were shown to the crowds only once every 7 seasons. The year she came happened to fall in a display cycle. The relics were to be shown at Aachen at the end of the month, and thousands of pilgrims from all over the empire were converging, and the roads for 100 miles around were choked with them. She joined the crowds. She came into Aachen with her friar on a Prussian mule and lodged at a wayfarer's inn. The showing was a strange thing, once every 7 seasons. On a set of high days, the chapter of the Aachen church hung out the 4 relics from a balcony at the west end of the nave for the crowd below to see. 20,000 travellers stood in the square. The chapter began. The chants. The relics were lifted, one by one, out over the crowd. A swaddling cloth of coarse linen, a small square of cloth stained brown, a folded gown of pale wool, a linen loincloth. The crowd cried out at each. She, at the back, held her friar's arm and looked. She did not weep loud. She only whispered and put her forehead against his sleeve and stayed a long while. Her book gives Aachen only a few lines. She was too moved to write more. The crowd at Aachen was of every kingdom of the empire. It stood 20 deep in the square below the chapel balcony, and it was made of Rhineland burghers and Flemish weavers, and Bohemian farmers and Polish nobles, and Hanseatic traders, and Grey friars and Dominican brothers, and it spoke in a dozen tongues at once. The chapter had set up a wooden barrier at the west door to keep the crowd from surging when the relics were shown, and a guard of the city in red and white livery stood along the barrier to hold the line. She, standing at the middle of it all, with her friar and her guide at either shoulder, could see the balcony. She had not expected, when she had joined the way at Wilsnack, that Aachen would give her a view, but the crowd around her had noticed a small old Englishwoman in a plain wool cloak, and had, in the way old-world crowds did with weeping wayfarers, made space for her to see. The showing went slowly, station by station. Each of the 4 relics was brought out in turn by 4 canons in pale cotta over black cassock, and was held out over the crowd for as long as it took the chapter to sing the appointed antiphon. The crowd knelt as each was brought out. 20,000 knees hit the cobbles at once. She knelt. She looked. When the loincloth from the cross came out, she gasped so hard that her friar beside her steadied her elbow. When the swaddling clothes came out, she uttered something in her own English that no one around her understood, and then she was quiet. The whole showing took an hour, and by the end of it she was standing again, held up on either side, tired to the bone and utterly at peace. She reported afterwards, when they had reached the inn, that she had seen the whole of the Incarnation in an hour in a Rhineland square, and that no life she had left in her would be enough to thank God for the sight. She came back by way of Calais and Dover in the middle of that winter. She was 61 and a half. She had crossed the North Sea twice more than she had thought she would. She had seen the shrines at Wilsnack and Aachen. She had held her Prussian granddaughter's palm. She had, on the sea crossing back, taken a chill that would trouble her chest for the rest of her days, and she landed at Dover in a fresh coastal wind and made her way to Lynn in a small wayfarer party who thought she was, given her age, the most stubborn Englishwoman they had ever met. She was inclined to agree. For a year and a half after Aachen, she was in her rest at Lynn. She was tired in her body. She kept to her own quarter. She went to mass at the parish daily. She went to visit her married daughters and her in their dwellings along the neighbouring lanes. She sat in the sun at the door of her hall in the afternoons and watched the town go by. Her weeping, which had been so noisy in her middle age, had begun to lay itself down. She wept still at mass at the Sanctus, but softly into the fold of her linen coif, and no one at this stage minded. She had become, by the second season of her widowhood, a fixture of the port, an old, thin, plainly dressed freeman's widow with a Norfolk accent and a Bethlehem stone in her purse, sitting at mass in the pew she had always sat in, and living the closing evening of a life. It was in this stretch, or perhaps a little after, that Master Robert Springald came to her one evening at the rectory and put it to her firmly that she should have her story written down. He had been urging it for a while. She had put him off. She could not write. She had never been taught. And the notion of dictating her days to a stranger was more than she could bear. But he was persistent. He argued, gently, that her memories had lessons in them that the town needed. The folk had been given a mystic and did not know what to do with her. He warned that if she died without a memoir, the port would forget her within a decade, and her tears would go with her into the ground. She sat a long spell in his cell, weighing it. She replied that she would consider, and a few days later, she agreed. She had a scribe at first, who was not much good. His name has come down to us only as a Lynn clerk of the town. Her memoir calls him only a man that had knowledge of my life. She sat with him 3 times a fortnight in the attic chamber of her own dwelling, a space she had never much used, above the hall, with a squint window over the lane, and a hearth in the corner, and a little wooden table, and 2 stools. And she talked, and he wrote. He was slow, he was careless. He was, she came to suspect, a little drunk on the beer she gave him after each session, and his hand was worse each visit than the last. When at the end of a stretch she carried the finished pages to Master Robert, he sat with them a whole evening at his parsonage, and came back the next morning and confessed that no one alive could read them. The writing was a scrawl. The Latin phrases the scribe had put in were wrong. The Norfolk phrases had been half misheard. It would not do. She wept, in the tired way of an elder who has wasted a long spell. The neighbours sat quiet on the matter for a while. She thought that it would not now be written. She was 63. Her chest was troubling her more each winter. And then, in a stroke of good fortune that her memoir records with grateful surprise, a youthful priest, a man of about 30, whose name has not come down to us either, only that he was one of Master Robert Springald's curates, came to her at the parsonage and explained that his rector had asked him to try. He was, he said, not sure that he could read the earlier draft either, but he would try, and he would sit with her in the coming months, and once he had made sense of it, would rewrite the whole thing in a clear scribal hand, and add whatever she wished to add out of her own mouth. He came for the first sitting on a Norfolk afternoon in the winter of what we would call 1436. She met him at the door and led him upstairs to the attic room. She lit a rushlight against the frosty dusk. She set out a cup of light ale for him. She showed him the first scribe's draft. He looked at it a while. He shook his head. He offered, kindly enough, that he could make out about 1 word in 3. Then he sat down at the table, sharpened a new quill with his penknife, opened a fresh sheet of good vellum, wrote the date at the top in his clean scribal script, the year of our Lord as noted above, and looked up at her. She sat down on the other stool. She started at the beginning. She was, at this point in her life, one of the finest tellers of Norfolk. 6 decades of memory had been piling up in her, and the piles had ordered themselves in the way that a long life orders itself when it is asked to be recounted. She began with her father, the mayor, and her dam in the Brunham Hall, and she moved through her childhood and her marriage to John Kempe, and her first childbed and its vision, and the failed brewhouse, and the failed mill, and the vow of chastity at the Yorkshire stile, and Julian in her anchor hold, and the way to Jerusalem, and the way to Rome, and her 3 examinations for heresy, and the great fire, and her husband's fall and his dying, and Wilsnack, and Aachen. She recounted it in her Norfolk English. She did not tell it in order all the time. She went round and back on herself, as an elder will. He wrote what he could, and asked her, at the end of each afternoon, to help him arrange the day's telling into the order he needed. She did. It was, in a sense, a joint work. But the voice on the page was hers. It took them nearly 2 long seasons. He wrote in the cold months and the spring, and set the work aside in the summer for his priestly duties, and came back to it in the autumn. He wrote a first volume of 39 chapters, which was the whole of her life up to about her Roman spell, and then a second, of about 10 chapters more, which was mostly her Baltic pilgrimage and the closing decades. He wrote them clean. He was, at first, sceptical of some of her more extravagant stories, the youthful man in the purple mantle, the shifting of the wind at the church fire, the tears at Compostela, and once he confided that he doubted her. And her book records, with a rueful pride, that within 7 days his own scepticism was broken by a small, quiet vision of his own at Mass. And he came back to her the following visit, a chastened cleric, and did not doubt her again. The scenes of the writing were the best hours of her old age. She would sit on her stool in the attic in her wool cloak, with a linen shawl over her shoulders, because the chimney did not draw well, and the room was chilly, and she would talk. He would sit on his stool at the table in his black priestly gown, and he would write. The rushlight would burn low. The wind would come round from the west and rattle the shutter of the squint. He would query her every now and then to be sure of a name. Was John Kempe 52 or 53 at the moment of his fall? Was Master Robert curate of the parish or of the North Church at the moment of the fire? And she would give him the answer, and he would write it. And then, at some hour of the evening, the Compline bell would ring, and she would rise, and he would rise, and he would carry away his sheets in a leather folder against his chest. And she would see him out at the door. He would return 3 times a fortnight. Some afternoons, the youthful curate would arrive to find her already asleep in her chair by the hearth, her rosary loose in her fingers, the fire down to embers. He would build it up quietly and sit at the trestle and read over the previous session's pages and wait for her to wake. When she woke, she would look at him a moment, as though she did not remember why a churchman was in her attic, and then recall and smile, and ask him for a cup of light ale before they began. On some afternoons, she would begin at once and speak for an hour. On others, she would sit a long while without speaking, and he would wait. And at last she would murmur that today the Lord had given her nothing to say, and he would gather his sheets and go. He never pressed her. He had learned early that pressing her was the surest way to end an afternoon with a blank page. She did not tell her memoir in the order it now stands. That order is the curate's work. She told it in the way an elder remembers, which is by association. A Norwich smell would recall Julian to her, and Julian would recall the Yorkshire wheat, and the wheat would recall Jerusalem, and Jerusalem would recall the youthful man in the purple mantle, and he would send her back to her 22nd calendar turn. The curate would write. Then, on a slow evening, he would go back to his lodging and cut the day's speech into its true chronology, and add it into its right place in the growing pile of vellum leaves, and mark up his queries in the margin against her next visit. He was, in this quiet, clerkly way, the first editor of the first autobiography in his tongue. His name we do not know, but his hand made the volume. We have, word of the work, got out slowly. The Dominicans of the borough, who had been her opponents for 3 decades, heard of it first and kept silent. They thought it might come to nothing, and they were content to wait. The Franciscans heard next and were pleased. Master Robert Springald had confided in the guardian of the White Friars that a project was in hand, and the guardian, an old friend of Master Robert's, had put his authority behind it. A merchant of the port who had gone up to the shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham for the Feast of the Assumption came home with a piece of gossip. That the mayor's daughter was dictating her days to a youthful curate, and that the curate was reckoned a good scribe, and the borough had thereby been told without her having to tell it. Small local visitors began to arrive. A widow of St. Nicholas would come round with a loaf of bread and would sit in the corner of the attic while she talked. A youthful mother of the Tuesday market brought her infant one day to have him blessed by the elder before she went back to her hall. A friar of the White Friars came, and sat, and listened, and went away without saying much. The curate, who had at first been jealous of these visitors, learned to work through them. His script went on quietly, at the trestle, even when the attic filled up for an afternoon with 3 or 4 neighbourhood women who wanted to hear the old telling. She, at the middle of them, seemed to speak more clearly with an audience. He did not sense whether that was a good thing or a bad thing for the memoir, but it was how she told. There was 1 hour in the cold season of 1437, or perhaps 38, that the curate never forgot. She had been speaking that day of the Church of the Nativity at Bethlehem, and had reached a moment where her voice, otherwise steady, had gone very soft. She had spoken something about the star on the pavement of the crib. He had bent over his page to write it down. When he had looked up again, she was sitting perfectly still, her eyes closed, her mouth open just enough to breathe, and no breath was coming out. He had feared, for 1 instant, that she had died. He had crossed himself. He had reached out to take her fingers, and then she had opened her eyes and looked at him kindly, and murmured, in a Norfolk voice she had not used for hours, that he should not fear. For she had only been at Bethlehem, and she had gone on with the telling. By the middle of 1438, the 2nd volume was finished. She was 65 and a half. She had told her whole life, from her first cradle at the Brunham Hall to her last landing at Dover, and it was written down in a clean scribal script on a stack of vellum leaves that could be bound between wooden boards. Master Robert Springald came to the attic on a summer evening and sat on the stool the curate had used, and read the whole draft, and gave it his approval, and passed it to the Franciscans and to the Dominicans for their approval too. It was passed, it was bound. It became a volume. It sat on a shelf in Master Robert's own room, and copies were made and sent to trusted friaries. The curate, whose hand had done the actual writing, was thanked and went back to his priestly rounds. She, at 65, went back to her dwelling in the lane. She did not have long left. Her memoir, having been finished, does not carry her further, but the town records preserve 1 more entry that concerns her. In the rolls of the Trinity Guild of Bishop's Lynn, the vast confraternity of the freeman class, to which her father had belonged, and which was the top guild in the port, her name appears in 1438, admitted as a sister of the guild. It was, in the old world way, a public honour. It meant that the neighbourhood had at last come round. The mayor's daughter, who had left as a suspect Lollard in 1417, was now at 65. A full sister of the guild her father had ruled. She was in some measure, forgiven. She was, more than forgiven, respected. She lived after that at home, for at least a season or two more. The exact date of her death has not come down to us. The Lynn records that survive from this stretch are patchy, and neither the Trinity Guild rolls nor the parish registers preserve an entry for her burial. Historians place her death somewhere between 1438 and the very early 40s. She would have been in her middle 60s, or perhaps 68. She died in the plain manner of a good widow, in her own bed, in the attic dwelling she had known for 4 decades, with Master Robert Springald at her side, and a candle at her pillow, and the Compline bell tolling in the evening. She was laid to rest beside her husband John, whose plot she had visited every week for 5 cold seasons running. Her grave has no surviving marker, but she is there, under some corner of the Norfolk stone. Her memoir, when she died, did not go with her. It went out into the world in the old world manner, copied by hand, passed from monastery to monastery, kept in a few private homes of the pious. A short devotional extract from it was even printed at London in about 1501 by the printer Wynkyn de Worde, as a small pamphlet of about 8 pages, which took only the visionary parts and left out the life and the pilgrimages and the marriage. It was reprinted once more at London in 1521, and then at the Reformation, when the vast monastic libraries of England were broken up. The fuller manuscript of her volume disappeared from the record. It slept. It slept for 400 years in a private library in the north of England, in the house of a Yorkshire Catholic family called the Butler Bowdens of Southgate House. It had been there since somewhere in the 16th century. Nobody knew what it was. It was kept in a chest with other old family papers. In the year we would count as 1934. In a bright Yorkshire summer, the Colonel Butler Bowden of the day had a friend from the British Museum staying with him for a shooting weekend, and the friend, over supper, asked whether the family had any old medieval papers he might look at. The Colonel took him to the chest. They opened it, they pulled out a stack of manuscripts and set them on the trestle. At the bottom was a well-preserved, late medieval Latin and vernacular book, bound between oak boards in a plain Norfolk hand. That began with the words, "This boke is a short treatise, and a comfortable for sinful wretches." The friend from the museum was a woman named Hope Emily Allen, an American scholar of medieval mysticism. She read the first page in the shooting lodge that evening. She turned another. She realized within a quarter of an hour that she was holding in her hands the lost autobiography of Margery Kempe, the earliest sustained autobiography in the English language, which had been missing since the Reformation. She sat down. She read the whole book in the quiet of a Yorkshire country house over the next 3 days. She wrote to her colleagues at the museum. The Butler Bowdens agreed that it would be published. The first modern edition came out in 1940. Every reader of medieval literature has known Margery Kempe by name ever since. Which brings, on this Norfolk evening in our own century, to a quiet closing. Before I let you go, if you have made it this far with us, and you feel that a life this warm and this weepy deserves not to sleep for another 500 years, the kindest thing you can do is to subscribe. Like the video, or leave a kind word in the comments if the mood is in you, so that the good people of the internet, who might not otherwise meet Margery, are shown the way to her. The channel is Medieval Nights, and there are more like this, waiting. That is the last time I will ask you for anything tonight. Picture the room she died in. It is the attic she had dictated her book in, or a chamber like it, somewhere in the old streets of Bishop's Lynn, on a Norfolk evening near the close of the 1430s. The shutter is drawn against the tidal wind off the Wash. A small hearth burns a little apple wood. A rushlight burns beside the bed. Master Robert Springald is at the trestle by the window, an old priest now himself, reading his office in a low murmur. Margery is in the bed, propped up on pillows in a plain linen nightgown, her white hair loose on the pillow, her thin hands folded on a wooden rosary. Her breathing is easy. She does not weep. The parish bell of St. Margaret's rings for Compline out over the Burgess Quarter, and the bells of St. Nicholas answer it, and the bells of the Franciscan house, and the Dominican house, and the White Friars all answer them in turn. And the Norfolk evening fills with the low music of a Lynn night. She listens to the bells with her eyes closed. She has heard them all her life. They will ring in a moment for her. Down at the wharf, the tide is at the turn. A Hansey cog is tied up along the timber, its lantern lit at the stern, its watchman doing the round of the deck. The mud flats beyond the wharf are wet under a Norfolk moon. A heron, of the sort that stood in her childhood's low water, is asleep on one leg on a shingle bar of the further bank. The salt wind blows in over the wash and turns the vane on the church tower a little to the east. Somewhere in the town, a baker has just lit his oven. For the morning, somewhere else a mother is nursing a child. Somewhere else a burgess is turning down his ledger for the day. And in an attic near the middle of the town, an old woman in a linen nightgown, whose life will be read 500 years after her, is going peacefully to her sleep. There is a book on the little table by the bed, bound between oak boards, in the clear Norfolk hand of a young priest who is long since dead himself. It is closed. It has been read out to her twice by Master Robert, all the way through in the past year. It says on its first page that this is a short treatise and a comfortable for sinful wretches. That is what she wanted it to be. It will do exactly that in the fullness of years. Comfort a sinful wretch or two in every century for 6 centuries. But for tonight, it is only closed on a linen table beside a linen bed. Its work will begin later. Her work is done. The rushlight burns lower. Master Robert crosses himself and goes to the pillow and takes her hand and says a Norfolk blessing over her. Christ shield thee and keep thee and gather thee home. She smiles a very small smile. She whispers a Latin word he cannot quite hear, but that he thinks is Amen. She closes her eyes. The tide turns under the wharf. The bell of St. Margaret's rings once softly in the middle distance. And Margery Kempe, of Bishop's Lynn in Norfolk, trader's daughter and trader's wife, mother to 14, pilgrim of Jerusalem, of Rome, of Compostela, of Wilsnack, of Aachen. The woman who wept her way to the Holy Land and dictated the first autobiography in her tongue, goes peacefully to sleep. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.